Chapter 1. Headlights lit up the dark country road in front of the beat-up, old station wagon that John Miller was driving. After another busy day, he found himself nodding off, barely able to keep his eyes open. Almost nobody took seriously the fact that driving tired was just as dangerous as driving drunk, especially not tired people. Besides, if tired people could choose not to drive tired, they would. But the whole world was tired. Might as well ask people not to work enough to support their families. Darkness covered his vision. He must have nodded off for a second, because he didn't notice a small figure run in front of his car. Not until it was too late. On the left side of the road was an oncoming truck, and to the right was a ditch that his instincts told him to swerve towards. Maybe they were right, given the circumstances, but he couldn't believe he ended up like that. He didn't even have the presence of mind to wonder who was running across a dark road in the middle of the night. Instead, there was a sharp impact and he fell unconscious. When he woke up, he knew something was wrong. His whole body hurt. He was groggy, but he knew that his whole body shouldn't feel like he was being stabbed. He wasn't dying or anything, but there was no way the hospital didn't give him any painkillers. He lay there for a while, not even willing to open his eyes. He couldn't handle seeing what was around him, acknowledging it was real. Maybe he was lucky and he was still dying in the ditch. That way, at least his life insurance could pay out. He simply couldn't handle more hospital bills, and the rest of his family was even less prepared for that. His family was... John breathed out heavily. It hurt. His lungs burned, though strangely only on the inside. He had to open his eyes. He probably had a concussion or something. Giving up and dying wouldn't help anybody. A little bit of money might help his family for a moment, but they needed more than that. He was the only one earning money, and he also couldn't just die on them. They were family, and he couldn't do that to them. When he opened his eyes, he found it was much brighter than he anticipated. Not bright exactly, but early morning sun instead of midnight. Was it really possible that nobody involved thought to call the police, and everyone else who passed by hadn't seen his car in a ditch? As his eyes adjusted, he saw he was wrong about something. Several somethings, in fact. First, he wasn't in a ditch. He was in a room. Not a hospital room, though. He was lying on his back on hard stone, seeing light stream in through unfamiliar windows. The windows in his training room that he'd never seen before, but were definitely his, or at least his parents'. He slowly sat up. Did people dream while dying? This was just like a dream, weird and surreal. He knew he felt pain, but he couldn't place it. He was able to sit up, even though he should have been dying. He knew things that weren't true. As he looked down at himself, he expected to see horrible wounds anyway, but he saw very clearly arms and legs and somebody's torso. His torso, but also it wasn't. Neither were the arms and legs. The most noticeable thing was that they were covered in strange clothing. Were those loose silk? Yes, he knew that. The finest silks in the region, woven from the finest stoneworm silk. John held a hand to his head. Definitely a dream. But wasn't he supposed to be able to do something once he was lucid? He could sit up, but nothing around him changed. He looked down to where he would find his t-shirt and jeans, but only saw more silk. What the hell even was a stoneworm? Dreams made no sense. He honestly had no idea what they were, except they produced fine silk, the finest in Marble County. He remembered that, and his body hurt. He looked over everything he could see. First of all, his hands weren't what he remembered them looking like. Not that different, but he did know the back of his own hand. His arms and legs were a bit too muscular, not chubby. He'd put on a few pounds lately. Even before that, he'd never looked like this. But he couldn't see a single wound. Yet he hurt everywhere. It was awful. Strangely, the pain didn't change with his slow movements. Not significantly anyway. It was like the pain was inside of him, but not part of his body. Not quite. Where was it then? The answer came to him quite clearly. It was in his meridians. His mind immediately recoiled at that thought, because it was strange. Weren't meridians a Chinese medicine thing? More importantly, that wasn't even the same word. He knew it meant the same thing, but he wasn't thinking in the same language. English and whatever the hell Western trade dialect was. He threw up on the ground next to him. Someone was in his head. That was his initial thought, but it was no less unsettling to his stomach when he came to the unfortunately more logical conclusion that he was in someone else's head, because he was thinking all the thoughts and summoning all of the memories. But the memories weren't his. They belonged to Fortkran Tenebach, whoever the hell that was. Except when he thought about it, the memories came flooding back to him. The most prominent of those was the very last memory. He was dead. John was probably dead. But Fortkran Tenebach was definitely dead. He recalled his final moments as he was attempting to break through from the spiritual collection phase to the foundation phase. He messed up and his meridians shattered. John, knew what these things were somehow, but using only his own memories, he only had a vague concept of what that might be, besides the obvious. Some sort of levels of power for martial arts, related power of some sort. That was the best he could do, especially with his own memories being fuzzy. He hoped they would come back smoothly, but before that he should probably stop dying on the floor of his training room. He shakily stood up. At least his muscles worked. He staggered out of the room, barely able to open the door, along through familiar yet new hallways towards his room. He saw a few servants and did his best to look like was in better condition than he was. He didn't know their names. Why didn't he know their names? There were only 10 or 20 of them, and they'd been around for years. Was his memory that messed up? His room was close by, though not immediately adjacent to the training room because of the space requirements. Fortunately, Fortkran remembered where some medicine was. John was slightly surprised to see wrapped paper around little pellets. They looked like kibble, kind of, but apparently they were medicine. Well, sure. This one should be good for repairing damage to meridians. His memories weren't clear on the exact details of that, but the sinking feeling in his stomach told him it was almost certainly nothing compared to what he had. Completely destroyed and exploded meridians. Enough to kill him, apparently. Well, it was better than nothing, and he didn't want to see the family doctor right now. Fortkran was habitually stubborn about those things, and John wanted to avoid people until he could at least slightly sort out his head. The pill went down easily, and almost immediately he felt the effects. His logical side told him that was the placebo effect. Pills didn't work that fast. However, the feeling of some sort of warm, smooth, comforting liquid being formed inside his stomach only increased. The memories native to this place knew what to do with that, and he was soon sitting down on a small mat in his room. He closed his eyes, concentrating to direct the medicine into his body. Strangely enough, it worked. Just because his memories told him it would didn't mean he had expected it to actually work. For one thing, the memories of his body didn't seem completely reliable. There were gaps that didn't just seem to be fuzziness, but things never learned to begin with. The medicine soothed his internal wounds. It dulled the pain from a large mass to more manageable and discrete little pathways. He could feel his meridians, like an extra set of blood vessels going throughout his body. They were in extremely terrible condition. That much was sure. As he carefully directed the medicine into them, it only seemed to stop things from falling apart, though hopefully the recovery would just be slower than the soothing part. John's head hurt, physically less than it had, but the mental stress certainly didn't help. What should he do next? All he wanted to do was go to sleep. He was in the body of a dead man with his memories. There wasn't any other trace of him, and in a strange world he barely understood, though he felt like he should have. Was sleeping advisable, injured as he was? Absolutely not. Was he going to do it anyway? Of course. It was better to collapse on a bed than on the floor, and he had no capacity to talk with anyone. He wasn't even sure if he could speak the language. Though he had memories of it, they weren't his. He was the one in control, as much as anyone could be called in control of a body that barely moved. He drifted off to sleep, real sleep. Not the strange half-sleep he'd experienced while he was probably dead. It was nice and peaceful, and he almost didn't care if he woke up, but he did at least a little. Chapter 2. Waking up once again was ultimately less disorienting than the first time, but more disappointing. John found that he was still in someone else's body, and perhaps more significantly in a different world. Fortkran Tenebach had certainly died, and John was fairly certain he had too. He was reminded of various forms of media where vaguely similar things happened. In those situations, people usually scrambled around to get sent back to their world. Certainly, he had responsibilities to attend to on Earth, and he would prefer to get back. But realistically, he couldn't. What was he going to do? Save the kingdom and then step through a portal back home instead of staying with new friends and statistically someone that had been fallen in love with? He wasn't even in a kingdom. The Stone Conglomerate was an allied group of smaller cultivator nations that basically governed themselves but acted in each other's defense. As far as he knew, there wasn't anyone that needed saving. Probably someone, but he couldn't do it because he was a normal person. And in a world of cultivators, even though he barely comprehended it, That meant he was a tiny ant. Even among his own family, or Fortkran's family at least, both his parents were late foundation phase cultivators, and his grandfather was beyond that in the soul expansion phase. This body, had been close to foundation phase but failed at the moment of breakthrough, dropping him back to the bottom of the spiritual collection phase, or below the bottom, since he didn't have a scrap of spiritual energy inside him. And his meridians, well, maybe they were very slightly recovered after taking the medicine. John found himself cursing for his body's reluctance to not seek out help. What were hired healers for if not seeking out when injured? However, it was too late to change that. He had arrived where he was. When he thought of telling anyone what happened, his body rejected the idea. He could override his feelings, but perhaps they were there for a good reason. Perhaps telling anyone would be a mistake, but he at least wanted to change some things. He got dressed. At least he had memory of where clothes were and what was appropriate to wear. Anything he set his eyes on he recognized naturally. Accessing memories wasn't too hard, but the gaps on knowledge he thought he should have were strange. But maybe it was just hunger. He knew Fortkran's parents wouldn't be up so early. Falling asleep in the middle of the afternoon had certainly made him wake up before normal, so he could have breakfast without having to talk to them. Avoiding people seemed like a good idea at the moment. What was he supposed to say? Hi. Sorry, but your son is dead and I took over his body. That was extremely untactful and potentially unwise. And he didn't want to lie, so avoidance was the best tactic. It seemed like they didn't speak every day anyway, so he could keep that up until he had a chance to think. When he entered the dining room, a servant quickly stuck his head out of the kitchen. "Young master, you're early." The servant hesitated a moment. "We can get started on whatever you wish, of course, but it takes time. Just get me something quick." John thought for a moment. What did he eat normally? Something like pancakes drenched in sugary syrup and slathered with butter. That was fine occasionally, but wasn't he supposed to be a martial artist? He looked down, finding he wasn't fat. But that didn't seem like the best breakfast diet regardless. "Just cook me something hearty. Sausage and eggs." The servant nodded. "Of course, young master." He turned to leave, but John called after him. "Wait." The servant turned around. "What's your name?" The servant hesitated half a moment and turned. "It's Wolf, young master." After Wolf turned his back, John frowned. He'd seen that servant before, probably every day, but he didn't know his name. And asking his name made him nervous. But he needed to know the names of his servants. Even though he was from modern Earth, John wasn't planning to upset the social system. Perhaps it wouldn't be fitting to become buddies with his servants, but knowing their names seemed entirely appropriate. Was he supposed to not? He didn't get a feeling either way, just that Fortkran hadn't thought it important. Breakfast had been delicious. There were creatures resembling chickens in this world, but he wasn't sure if the eggs were from them or something else. They were certainly quite large in either case and quite rich. The sausage was excellent as well. John had the feeling he didn't want to know how much his food cost, though he couldn't compare it to how much the servants made because he honestly didn't know that part. Just that the clan was well off, having several high-ranking cultivators, at least for the area they lived in. From the few memories he had of watching cultivators fight or sparring, he knew how much difference each cultivation level made, and each phase was split up into 9 levels. Either of his parents could probably kill him with a single finger. Not that they would, if they thought he was Fortkran. He would deal with that later. First, he wanted to try to at least fix some problems with himself, like having lost all of his cultivation. That was important. And even though he had a cushy life as a young master of a clan, he was expected to cultivate and do well at it. Fortkran had some cultivation methods memorized, but there was a slight problem. He hadn't cultivated until he had been blessed by the family's guardian beast. Even though his eyes had seen it, he didn't know what it was. Just a changing shape in the darkness, and intimately connected to that element. Was darkness bad? John thought about that. Fortkran didn't seem like he had been the most pleasant fellow as he was going through the memories, but there was nothing about the elemental darkness that had seemed malignant. He hadn't had to kill anyone or kick a puppy to use the power. It just seemed to be something that absorbed the force of attacks as armor and could be added to his own strikes to damage enemies, much like any other energy. In theory, in partly remembered theory, Fortkran had cultivated more or less diligently, but he hadn't done a lot of reading. John planned to rectify that, and the Tenebach clan just so happened to have a private library. Sitting at a desk inside the entrance of the library was an older man, but John could feel a sense of power coming from him. He couldn't quite place the magnitude of it, but if he recalled correctly, he should have been at the 13th cultivation level, about middle foundation phase. He stood as John entered and bowed. "Good morning, young Master Fortkran." "Good morning, Xianxia." John inclined his head. Apparently names were worth remembering if the owner was strong. He agreed with that, but that wasn't the only reason to remember someone's name. "I'll just be browsing the shelves." Of course, Xianxia returned to his seat. John internally breathed a sigh of relief as he moved behind the shelves. Hopefully the man hadn't noticed his drop in cultivation, though maybe he thought it was being hidden. Either way, it was too late to change anything. He browsed the shelves for books. At least he was able to dredge up a few memories of the library, though they were indeed few. Mostly he had to figure out the organizational system before he was able to pick a few books off the shelves. An important one was an overview of spiritual totems. John knew Fortkran had been able to connect to a spiritual totem of the third layer. A reasonable enough achievement for a first totem, but nothing impressive for a young master of a clan. It was known as the Claws of Darkness, and had allowed him to have a unique combat style. However, John was unable to feel any connection to it. Perhaps he just needed to cultivate, but he was hoping he could select one once he began cultivating. Or at the very least, he wanted to be informed for the second totem he could bind to once he reached foundation phase. The worst-case scenario, besides just being a cripple now, was that he couldn't connect to a totem at the spiritual collection phase at all. He hoped that wasn't true, but the thought crossed his mind. He picked up a few other books. He had enough to keep himself occupied for a long time, and to keep him from thinking about Earth and how things were going there, because he couldn't do anything about that, and instead had to deal with what he had now. He also went further into the back, past a set of wards that easily allowed him passage. That was where actual cultivation methods were kept. He picked out a few basic ones. They weren't tied to a particular element, so anyone could cultivate them in theory. Theory, theory, theory. So much theory, and he didn't know if he could do anything at all. Maybe it didn't matter if his meridians were covered. Maybe John, who wasn't even from this place, couldn't do it. He hated that thought too. As he left the library, he caught an uncomfortable shift out of the corner of his eye. As the young master of the Tenebach clan, he could take whatever he wanted from the library for however long he wanted. But perhaps Xianxia would like some assurances. He turned around and stepped back inside, placing his armful of selections on the desk. "I decided it was time to review some basics. You can let anyone looking for these particular works know they are in my hands." Fortkran wouldn't have said they could come talk to him, and he would give it to them, so John didn't either. On the other hand, Fortkran had borrowed some books that never made it back to the library, and John was going to make sure they did, or at least any he could still track down. Chapter 3. Cultivation manuals seemed to be extremely dense. John could see why the former owner of his body had been reluctant to dive into them, but all it took was a bit of interpretation to find what was important. When the book said a cultivator must have a mind as still as water and a flawless heart, what it really meant was that it was best to practice cultivation somewhere with no distractions. One area he did need to pay attention to, even the fine details, was the actual cultivation itself, gathering spiritual energy and passing it through his meridians. The first part wasn't dangerous and was actually supposed to be quite relaxing, but the second had obvious dangers. The path that spiritual energy circulated through the meridians clearly made a difference, though he would need more experience to know how. The dangers from a lack of control were extremely apparent to him, because he found his meridians in their current state. Breaking through to the next stage was harder than normal cultivation, but the results were still clear. Failure was unpleasant. It wasn't clear to John if he could collect spiritual energy, but if he was going to do so, his training room was the right place. It was set up for that very purpose, without distractions and with a small spiritual gathering array. As he walked into the room with that awareness in mind, he felt his hairs stand on end. Certainly, something was different, but it was hard to say what exactly. He sat down and steadied his breathing, looking over the manual in front of him once again. This was the moment he would give himself a pep talk, but an internal one seemed more appropriate. "You can do this, John Miller. Even if your name is extremely plain, this is something almost everyone in this world can do. And if you can't, Why are you even alive again? So the internal pep rally didn't actually help. What did help was the sound of a trickling fountain and the calming atmosphere. He closed his eyes and reached out for spiritual energy. At least he had Fortkran's memories to guide him, including a number of initial failures. It was both surprising and extremely natural when he condensed spiritual energy inside his dantian, a strange organ akin to a stomach for storing spiritual energy, in the same way that meridians were veins that carried spiritual energy and not blood. In a way, since all the spiritual energy flowed from there, it was more like a heart. But hearts didn't really store blood. Maybe lungs? Or maybe it didn't have to have an exact analog. He wasn't sure how long it took, but as he breathed in, he pulled in spiritual energy, and as he breathed out, he expelled mostly just air, leaving the spiritual energy behind in his dantian. It took more than an hour to fill up what he had with the wispy, misty-feeling spiritual energy. It was slow, but the process wasn't unpleasant even so. The next part, however, was much less comfortable. As he first attempted to circulate the spiritual energy through his meridians, he felt a stabbing pain. They had been completely ruined the day before. After all, it made sense that they wouldn't take well to being used. John sighed. Could he really do nothing? If he continued to take medicine, the benefits would flatten out and the side effects would build up. He looked through some of the cultivation manuals for answers. He was fortunate that one of them mentioned damaged meridians. It seemed as long as the cultivator was careful, damaged meridians could actually benefit from cultivating. Of course, the potential was also there to cause harm. But though it was his first time making the attempt, he also strangely had experience that came into his mind. He was still getting used to having memories that weren't his. Would it ever not be strange? Slowly, carefully, he began again. He didn't force anything, just pulling a tiny strand of spiritual energy through the beginning of the path. When he felt the pain, he recognized that it wasn't so bad. It was an aching pain, not of hurting himself, but stretching something that was in bad condition. As long as he didn't take it too far, it would be good for him. As the spiritual energy moved through the damaged meridian, tiny fragments of it broke off, seeping into his body. His body should have already been fortified by spiritual energy, as Fortkran had cultivated almost to the foundation phase, but it seemed the damage had stretched to more than just the meridians. Though, his body was still better than what John had been used to. Eventually the strand dried up, but John immediately reached for another to pull along the same path. It went slightly further, until he settled into a slow, methodical pattern. As he did so, his thoughts wandered. The only sound in the room was a steady beeping, rhythmic, but not pleasant. Even so, it was better to have it than not. The rising and falling sound let John and his mother know that John's father was still alive. The doctors said he would likely recover. He was young enough that a heart attack wasn't the end of things. That said, it couldn't be taken lightly either. John had rushed from his class at university when he got the call. Now, he was sitting uncomfortably next to his father, who was asleep. He didn't need to be there. But being anywhere else, he would have the same worries and none of the support. The same was true in the other direction. He could provide support to his parents by his presence. His homework sat open on his lap, but his pencil hadn't moved in half an hour. The hospital room was just the start. With a heart attack came all sorts of complications and bills. It wasn't long before John had to drop out, with his parents unable to pay for him and insurance not covering all of the bills. He got a job working part-time at a burger joint, a stopgap job just for the moment, to bring in some extra money. Things started to turn for the better, until disaster struck once again. Once more the news came with a phone call, not from either of his parents but a cousin. A fire had burned down their home. They needed a place to stay, just for a little bit. John and his parents were happy to do so, but helping out was another drain on time and energy. A racking cough filled his lungs, or someone's lungs. John wasn't sure if it was appropriate to call them his yet. He couldn't hold back as he coughed up black gunk, black and dark red, blood and something else. It was disgusting. But once he could breathe again, he felt better. His meridians were still in a bad state, but the throbbing ache was lessened. He had used up most of the spiritual energy he had gathered, but he felt better. Even the black gunk probably wasn't bad. Fortkran Tenebach's memories knew that cultivation could cleanse the impurities from the body. John hadn't thought it would be quite so literal, but there were other memories of something similar. It was disgusting, but he ultimately felt better. Now that he knew he could cultivate, at least at a basic level, he needed to know something else. Spiritual energy was the basis of all cultivation, and martial techniques let a cultivator use them. But the core of a cultivator's true power came from spiritual totems. The difference between a spiritual collection phase cultivator with one and one without was several times as much power. Twice, 3 times, even up to 5 times as much for those who reached the 5th layer. The latter was only accomplished at the spiritual collection phase by world-shattering geniuses, and honestly maybe not at all. The stories weren't necessarily so accurate, but either way Fortkran had managed to get a 3rd layer totem. As for the difference at foundation phase, it was literally everything. Or said another way, nobody reached foundation phase without a spiritual totem. They aided cultivation as well as combat. And at foundation phase cultivators could gain a 2nd spiritual totem and add to their power. John couldn't feel a connection to the claws of darkness, even now that he had spiritual energy. He wasn't sure if he could ever reconnect with his real family, but Fortkran's family was relying on him to cultivate properly. It was the only way to achieve any real status in the world. And personally, he didn't feel like being on the bottom rung in a second world, so he needed a spiritual totem. Once again, he had memories to guide him. They were better than an instructor, but worse than personal experience. Even so, he was ecstatic to find that as soon as he had the intention to reach out to the spiritual plane and the totems therein that he was pulled out of his body. It was a strange, jarring feeling, but exactly what was supposed to happen. He found himself floating among totems representing anything, of every element. There were swords covered in fire and frost, and some radiating only a sense of pure sharpness. John looked around for anything with the darkness element, spotting a few. But as he approached, he felt a pressure from the entire area. He would have to overcome that pressure to choose a totem, and on higher levels the pressure would be even more. John let himself be pushed back into his own body. Everything was fine. He hadn't expected to actually connect to a spiritual totem on his first attempt anyway. He had to get used to the process and strengthen his spiritual energy, then push towards the deepest and strongest level he could, before finally finding something that suited him. So he'd accomplished his goal. He couldn't even reach out for the spiritual plane if he wasn't eligible for a totem. As far as dying went, things had been pretty good for him. Being taken from his world and put in a body with nearly destroyed meridians was still probably better than death, though he wasn't sure how he would feel once someone found out who he really was. He still had to consider that. He couldn't keep up his honestly pathetic facade for long. Chapter 4. When he got called to the family's formal meeting room, John knew he was caught. He'd spent the last week avoiding his parents as much as possible, but there were limits to that. He had to eat. And though their interactions at meals had been limited, they must have picked up on it there. If nothing else, it was probably obvious that his cultivation was in tatters. Should he have mentioned that? Probably. Yet not mentioning it was also something the original Fortkran Tenebach would have done. What a mess. The family is waiting for you, young master. A servant gestured to the doorway to the formal meeting room. John could vaguely sense a number of people through it. It was nice, actually, being able to sense spiritual energy. He wasn't that good at it yet, but it was a useful ability. Too bad he wouldn't be able to use it, or anything else he learned when he was dead. Thank you, Charles. John nodded his head to the man by the door and opened it. When he stepped inside, he saw someone he hadn't recognized by their spiritual energy. Not with his own memories anyway. Once he saw her face, the memories of her were triggered much more substantially. They'd only met once or twice in person, but he regularly received paintings of her, so he would recognize her as she aged. Her dark skin was reminiscent of her father and grandfather. Their marriage had been arranged by the grandfathers of the clans before they were even born, in fact. A political alliance, not particularly strange to Fortkran but a bit alien to John. She was his fiancée, Mateo Brandel. Her presence made things more awkward, but not that much. He did note she was in the foundation phase, in the 2nd level even. All of the other figures in the room provided even more pressure, looking at him. His parents radiated a stronger foundation phase energy, and he withered under the stares of 2 of his uncles. But what made him almost collapse unconscious was the most overbearing pressure in the room. His grandfather and the only soul expansion phase cultivator in the clan. His grandfather wasn't even trying that hard. Even so, Luctus Tenebach had that sort of impression on people. He was the first one to speak. Fortkran, I am sure you have some idea of why you have been called here. He bowed as he stepped into the room and moved to his position. I have an inkling, yes. Please, allow me to explain myself before you make any judgments. Luctus waved his hand, which was enough. John tried to pick his words carefully, ignoring the thought that he should just lie. 1 week ago, Fortkran Tenebach, was cultivating. John closed his eyes as he spoke, unable to stand up to the pressure of looking at those in front of him. He was attempting to break through to the foundation phase. Perhaps he was unprepared or too hasty, or perhaps he was unlucky, but he failed. In that process, his meridians were destroyed, and he died. That same night, at least as far as my memories go, I was traveling. I lost control and went off the road, and then I died. Somehow, my wandering soul found its way into Fortkran's body, reviving it enough to seek healing medicine. John shook his head. I did not take his body of my own intention, but I am sorry to say that Fortkran Tenebach is dead and I have taken possession of it. When he opened his eyes, the expressions he saw weren't the anger he thought he might see. Instead, there was disbelief, confusion, and an unreadable face. John felt as if Luctus was seeing through him, into his very nature. For all he knew, he was. That might be possible, especially at such a cultivation level. He trembled, unable to shake off the fear of death. All it would take was one move by anyone else in the room, and that would be it. Finally, Luctus spoke. Your words are difficult to believe. They seem like a convenient excuse to forgive you your behavioral flaws. Your cultivation mishap is also disappointing. John blinked. He didn't believe him, but it wasn't just about his cultivation failure either. Had Fortkran done something that was worth reprimanding so formally? John passed through memories that weren't really his. Sure, he was quite impolite to the servants. He was a bit of a slacker in his cultivation, and he didn't choose healthy meals. When he went into town, he apparently spent a bit too much money on himself. Then there was the gambling. That hadn't really come up, because John hadn't probed that area of memories. Then the prostitutes. That wasn't a good look for a young master of a clan. John grimaced. That wasn't the whole list either, but it was all he could handle. I hadn't come across some of those memories. That was it then. He was going to die either way, or be disowned with no skills of use in the world. He couldn't even say he didn't deserve it, or that Fortkran didn't. Anyway, once again, his grandfather spoke. Can you prove you are a different person? Could he? Did he even need to? He was so different. But then again, people could act differently for many reasons. Had they not even noticed? I have my memories from my previous life. Just the eyes told him that wasn't enough. He hadn't even told them he was from another world, but substantiating his words would be impossible regardless. He could just make things up. I no longer have my spiritual totem for the spiritual collection phase. I was planning to connect to a new one. Nope, not good enough. What else? I could go see the guardian beast. Luctus stared sternly at John, or at least at the body he was in. You must be aware that attempting to receive a second blessing from the guardian beast will only result in death. It is once per person. John bowed his head. I don't even know if it would do it, since I'm technically not a Tenebach. He couldn't think of anything else though. Fine. You may make the attempt, Luctus proclaimed. If you die, you die. If you receive a second blessing, or if you are a different person that receives a first blessing, we can consider forgiving your actions. Thank you. John didn't know what else to say. Maybe that wasn't even appropriate, because he was about to go meet a shadow beast that was going to kill him. The family's guardian beast was kept underground, or perhaps it was better to say it chose to dwell there. It lived in a dark cave, as much as it lived at all. Perhaps someone had more knowledge about it, but Fortkran didn't know much more than that. John probably should have tried to figure it out, but he barely had time for all the things he'd tried to do. And honestly, he had been pretty confused about the whole thing. He wondered if he would end up in a new body, but probably not. Even if the guardian beast didn't tear his soul apart, the chances of ending up in another body had to be pretty slim, though he didn't know the mechanism for such a transfer to begin with. Maybe he should just kill himself, but he wasn't brave or crazy enough for that, and maybe a bit too hopeful. He walked into the dark cave, waiting where the deepest shadows dwelled. "Oh, great guardian beast," I come to seek your blessing." The sound that came out from the darkness was a strange combination of the growl of a wolf and the hiss of a snake. He thought he heard some bird in there as well. Strangely enough, the shadows pulled away from him, such that he could see most of the cave, except the creature itself. It was merely a silhouette, but not one that remained fixed in any one way. Fortkran Tenebach, young master of the Tenebach clan. You know I do not provide a second blessing to anyone. How extremely foolish. John went into a full panic. How do I explain this? His mind raced, but the panic suddenly snapped into a sort of honest clarity. I'm not him. He died, and I just happened to end up in his body. I was sort of hoping you could tell that, and wouldn't choose to kill me. And even though I can't possibly be from the clan, the only way for me to live is to get this blessing. The shadowy voice barked, seemingly from all directions and even inside him. Huh. A foolish bluff. You should know I can easily dispel your lie. Like this, the shadows jumped, spreading back throughout the room and simultaneously seeping into John. It was cold and dark, freezing, uncaring, concealing, and mysteriously full of more than he expected. Look, you are? He felt the darkness swirling around, not lying. How curious. The shadows pulled away, out of their uncomfortable position inside him. He got the feeling of a face pressed up right next to his, though he couldn't see it. I don't give blessings to the same person twice. It's pointless. Even those I favored, the result was the same. But I can see your cultivation, or at least that of your body, has completely reset. Your meridians are in a bad state, but they will heal. Now I am curious. So you'll be getting your wish, one way or another. Strange human from another world. As those last words were spoken, the darkness dived back inside of him, more forcefully and completely. There was a strange instant where the entire room was revealed around him, without light to make it visible, but without a speck of darkness to hide it. Then his mind was overwhelmed, and his consciousness faded. Chapter 5. When John awoke, the cave was dark. That was what his mind said it must be, but he could see into the furthest corner, despite there being no source of light. Just in case, he checked himself. Clearly, no light was coming from him. In fact, he could sense it would be quite the opposite. Inside his meridians, once more and for the first time ever, flowed spiritual energy with an attribute of darkness. However strange it was, the unpleasant aspects of it were actually muted. It was chill, but not freezing. Dark, but the comforting sort that brought about sleep. Not the sort of darkness that concealed things. Not from him. Not anymore. Well, John stood up. He was a bit shaky, but in a good way. As if he had just run a marathon. It was unpleasant, but he felt like he would be better after he recovered. I guess it worked. He bowed into the darkness, though he was nearly certain the guardian beast couldn't see him. Thank you for your blessing. John thought for a second. Would it be inappropriate to ask for your name? There was a cackling, echoing from the far ends of the caves and from inside of him at the same time. Last time, he didn't even think about it. I think I will decline to tell you my name at this time, but you may come to know it in the future. John nodded, still unsure if he could be seen, and made his way back outside where his family waited. Fortkran's family? Whatever. The prominent members of the Tenebach clan, plus one other. He bowed respectfully upon seeing them. The guardian beast has seen fit to bless me. I hope that you now believe my words are true. His grandfather, Luctus Tenebach, stepped forward. A hand was placed on his head, and he felt his internal darkness being pulled on, just slightly called to by the energy inside the powerful figure in front of him. As the powers touched, they recognized each other, though one was old and one was new. There was a sigh, and then he spoke. I have no idea who you are, but you have to be better than him. He was taller than John, enough to be extra intimidating as his face became close. You will be better than him, won't you? It seems you know how to behave, but we need you to keep it up. I can. John held up his hands. I might, not know everything I should do, but I can learn. His parents stepped forward next. You're really someone else? His father looked over him. It's hard to believe. But we talked to the servants. You're clearly not the same. Good. Welcome to the family. His fiancée Mateo stepped forward and held out her hand. Almost by instinct, he took it and kissed it. He felt her almost pull back, but she let him. Fortunately, he didn't seem to have made the wrong move. John smiled awkwardly. Technically, we haven't met before. He looked at everyone. I will be happy to be part of the family. Fortkran's positive feelings for his own family had been somewhat limited. However, even though he didn't take note of them, John was able to recall memories that showed them in a better light. Though he'd been chastised many times, it had always been for things he deserved. They'd just been trying to make him better. He hadn't been able to see that. John wasn't that much older than him, but he was more experienced with the world. Maybe that just meant he'd made his mistakes and faced hardship earlier, but he found himself growing closer to his new family. It wasn't quick, but he grew closer to them every time they interacted. He still thought about his family on Earth, but there was no way to get back to them. He explained some details of who he formerly was to his family. They found it strange, but it seemed there was some precedent for those claiming to be from other worlds. It was extremely rare, but then again a cultivation clan was more likely to encounter oddities. John found himself with new responsibilities, which were just old responsibilities he hadn't really been taking care of. The basic summary of them was just to not screw anything up. Don't make the clan look bad. Also, he was supposed to cultivate properly. He had no problem with that, because he was aware he couldn't do much in the new world if he didn't. It was actually quite easy, because he had the direct guidance of his grandfather. There was a large amount of information about later phases he wasn't prepared to make use of yet, but it was good to know where he was aiming, and to talk to someone with actual experience. Fortkran had received some guidance, but apparently he was unpleasant enough to teach that it had been cut off. John had those memories, but Fortkran had just assumed he had learned what he needed to, even with no evidence to support that. His current ability to cultivate was still limited, even after the blessing. He hadn't yet formed a connection to any spiritual totem, so he was mostly filled with undirected spiritual energy. Not completely undirected, but it was surprisingly less darkness-focused than he thought it would be. Taking his time to get a proper spiritual totem was wise, and even encouraged. The higher layer of spiritual totem he could connect to, the better. It wasn't related to his cultivation power directly, but instead his ability to sense them as well as to resist the pressure of the higher levels. It was more related to the purity of his spiritual energy and the meridians that the spiritual energy flowed through. Immediately after the blessing, he'd been able to stay in the second layer of spiritual totems for longer, and the more he cultivated and recovered his meridians, the more he would be able to do. Soon enough, he might take a step into the third layer of spiritual totems, but he wasn't sure if he could go beyond there. Eventually, he would have to pick a totem to allow his cultivation to truly progress. John found himself once again in the sea of spiritual totems. It was often called a sea, anyway. It didn't really matter what it was called, though. The point was, spiritual totems could be connected to a cultivator in that place that was not a place. Theoretically, all cultivators had access to every totem, though confirming that completely was impossible. Regardless, John browsed through them. The space between them was nothing, but traversing it could take time. He had to move himself carefully to stop and see each totem as he passed it. There were at least hundreds on each layer, though he was more easily able to approach some of them. He now once again had his affinity for darkness. Thinking of Fortkran as someone else was more correct, but all those memories and the body were his now. Nobody was around to voice a complaint. So, his affinity for darkness let him more easily approach anything that shared that element. However, any of the basic elements were within possibility. He wasn't sure if he would want to connect to an air or fire totem, and certainly light would be out of the question, but water or earth were associated with darkness. Since he resided in Marble County, which was part of the stone conglomerate, he had more access to cultivation techniques that fit along the lines of earth. The Tenebach clan had at least basic cultivation methods for any element, but more for darkness and aligned elements given their affinities and just what they could get their hands on. He didn't have to pick darkness, but it would be the easiest. However, that wasn't always the best in the long run. He now had an affinity for darkness, but was his mental affinity appropriate for that? Would he learn it well? That was impossible to say in the long run. Spiritual totems were cataloged as well as possible in the library. He could research which ones he might like to form a connection to there more easily. since he was limited in the time he could be in the spiritual sea. But experiencing them firsthand was better when he could. Even without forming a connection, he could get a sense for how a particular totem worked, its elements, strengths and weaknesses, and its potential. But much of that seemed to be based on the layer. It seemed almost pointless to even bother looking at those on the first layer, but at least it got him used to the pressure so he could take a look around the second layer. He was eyeing a few things. He hoped to reach the third layer soon. He knew he would definitely not be choosing the Claws of Darkness again, not because they were a poor choice, but he didn't want to make the same choice. He liked one he found on the second layer. It had a sense of subtlety, a person darting between shadows and striking suddenly. He thought it was called the Dancing Shadow or something. That said, something from the third layer would probably be better. But first he had to keep making the attempts to get himself used to the pressure and tempering his meridians to be as strong as they could to support him. Chapter 6. Cultivation came with a refreshing feeling like exercise, but like exercise there was only so much of it one could reasonably do in a day. John wasn't equivalent to an Olympic athlete, but even they didn't spend 24 hours per day exercising. He worked as hard as he thought was reasonable to push himself, both for his own gains and for his new family and the only people he really knew. They were relying on him to at least be decent, and he needed their support. When his cultivation fell apart after trying to break through to the foundation phase, he lost years of progress, though at least he retained the experience that went with it. Along with spiritual energy cultivation, he engaged in a little bit of physical exercise. Weapons training was included there, and he was, technically, glad to have access to excellent trainers. At least he would be once his body stopped aching. Yet even when he was exhausted, he sought out the library. He supposed he needed to find some sort of entertainment to keep him from going crazy, but for the moment he was focused. He was studying up on what spiritual totems the clan had record of, and comparing his own experiences and insights with what was written. First layer spiritual totems were weak, but knowing about them couldn't hurt. So he started there. HRMN. He heard over his shoulder. Even without looking, he could recognize Mateo, his fiancée. Sensing others' spiritual energy seemed to be an important ability. Of course, that meant he'd given his drop in cultivation away when he came to the library the first time and saw Xianxia, but he hadn't been fully aware of that. It could have even been sooner, and perhaps his parents had looked for him when he was avoiding them. John looked back towards Mateo. Suddenly having a fiancée was strange. He wasn't sure how he felt about arranged marriages to begin with, and especially not one who had been arranged to marry. Not him. Then again, it wasn't like they'd ever been close. As for the woman herself, he had no objections to her. She was attractive, with dark skin that seemed uncommon in the nearby area, and of course very talented in cultivation. In this world, that was one of the things that mattered most. Her personality seemed pleasant enough. Even so, he wasn't particularly eager to actually marry someone he barely knew and didn't really choose to. That said, the current state of engagement seemed sufficient for making all parties happy at the current moment. "You're staring at my face," she frowned. "Sorry, you're just new. But if you'd prefer." She turned her head back and forth, though she had to be able to sense the lack of others nearby without doing so. "Absolutely not. You're already much better than the previous you. At the very least, you can put up a good face for a time." John knew that eventually she would recognize his genuineness, but he could also see her caution. "You still sounded disappointed." "Well, I was hoping you would have more skill in cultivation now." Her eyes rested on the book that was still open to totems of the first layer. "Regardless, I have seen your effort." Gerben and Celia suggested that it might be good for you to spar with someone to get a better feel for mobilizing your spiritual energy in a practical manner. In short, his parents were telling him to do it. Nicely. He didn't mind that. Perhaps that would be for the best. "I assume you've scheduled something for tomorrow?" Mateo nodded. "You will need to rest well." A good day started with a good breakfast. It was much easier for John to have a good breakfast when he didn't have to cook it himself. To be fully honest, having cooks and servants made it impossible for him to reasonably complain about anything that happened to him. Sure, he might be heading out to get beat up, but at least he would be comfortable before and after. Also, he was supposed to be learning something, so ultimately it would be good for him. After he ate a moderately sized breakfast, enough to fill him up but not overstuff him and hamper his movements, he geared up for the day. First was his armor. It was real armor, though not heavy. However, it was much more than just padding for sparring. The knowledge that he would be fighting with safe weapons didn't particularly make him feel better. After all, spiritual energy was the most dangerous part. Mateo was a foundation phase cultivator, so she could kill him with basically no effort. Not that he thought she would. If he was going to die, it would have already happened. As far as such things went after a few weeks, he thought both she and the rest of his family had a fairly solid opinion of him. They were clearly still taking into account his newness, but he was as well. In his head, he was still John, but at least he properly responded to being called Fortkran. Weapons. He had to pick a weapon. He wasn't interested in claws, even with some experience there. They required getting to close, which was a foolish idea against someone better than him. Even so, a spear wasn't quite what he wanted. He settled for a long two-handed sword, or a rounded piece of some extremely durable piece of wood that was vaguely sword-shaped. Anyway, it had a crossguard, at least. He was fairly certain that even if he was using a real sword, he couldn't hurt a foundation phase cultivator, but being safe was for the best. He faced Mateo in the family's sparring field, the private one, because they had many. The Tenebach clan had some cousins and the like, and while some might be a better match, his current status was being kept under wraps. He didn't have to reach the foundation phase, but he should at least once again reach the 9th level of the spiritual collection phase. But now, he was more or less in the first. Then again, he hadn't been trying to increase his cultivation level. He still hadn't even chosen a totem. Ready? Mateo asked. She looked quite intimidating in her own armor, with her hair tied back. She had a sword of her own, a lighter one-handed version similar to the real sword she used. John nodded. After he did so, she nearly disappeared from his sight. He knew she restricted her offensive power to be similar to an early spiritual collection phase cultivator, but even without directly calling on her 2 spiritual totems, she would outclass him. The air in front of her shimmered like a mirage, and all he could do was stab his sword in front of him to try to catch her. His guess had been right, but she swiftly flowed around beside him, striking his side. His spiritual energy cushioned him from the blow, but he still most certainly felt it. John did his best to keep his form, moving his sword as little as possible to achieve what he wanted. Mateo's water-type cultivation easily moved with any parry he did, but he was at least able to somewhat limit her attacks. And even when he was struck by water elemental spiritual energy, he gained something from it. Besides, pain, of course. He could feel how it moved, how it flowed. Of course, of all elements, water elemental spiritual energy flowed most. Traditionally. But the point was he got to experience it in action. He even manipulated his own energy to try to better resist it. With his spiritual energy being darkness infused, he was able to make some attempts. He managed to freeze some of it. One of the main interactions between darkness and water was ice. However, he was pretty sure Mateo let that happen. As he was thinking he would prefer not to get hit so much, he thought about absorbing it. Darkness could pull in other elements, in theory. So he tried. His concentration probably got him struck a few extra times before he finally managed even the slightest success, but he thought he got something. There wasn't a net gain in spiritual energy on his end, but he wound up with a bit of watery spiritual energy of his own. Coating his weapon with it and swinging it at Mateo was exhilarating for the several seconds he had it before she blasted it away from his weapon, and he was left to return to his normal energy. He thought that maybe he could try converting a bit of his energy to every element to see what it was like, before selecting his totem. Afterwards, it would be much harder to do. A small sacrifice for growing several times in power, and of course it would be much easier to get whatever sort of spiritual energy he actually wanted once he was attuned to a relevant totem. John continued absorbing little bits of water elemental spiritual energy, using them for defense where they were at least able to absorb a blow or two. He felt his control was improving greatly. It would be good for him, as long as he remembered as much as possible after he passed out. Because while he absolutely couldn't win, he didn't want to stop before he absolutely had to. He had thought his body might give out first, but instead it was his spiritual energy. He was drained empty, but it was quite satisfying nonetheless. He managed to collapse more or less gracefully to one knee, and then onto his side before he truly lost consciousness. Chapter 7. His mind once again came down from his state of connection with the sea of spiritual totems. He'd finally clawed his way up to the 3rd layer for a few moments, confirming that with his spotting of the claws of darkness that Fortkran had used. He didn't have long to look over other totems, but he got a strange feeling. He wanted to be as strong as possible in this world of cultivation, but compatibility was important. But there was something else tugging at him. He was quite capable of attuning to any of the darkness element spiritual totems he could reach. That meant he should find one he liked on the third layer and accept that. But even though he could stay in the second layer for extended periods, he found himself drawn to the first layer. First layer spiritual totems were the weakest available. However, there were a subset of spiritual totems that could grow in power. In the first layer, the most well-known were the elemental seeds. For those who couldn't access totems of the second layer, they were ideal. With proper training, the seeds could sprout into elemental trees of the second layer and make up for the deficiency with enough time. It was less efficient than just selecting a spiritual totem of the second layer that had the qualities that suited the user required, but enough for those who couldn't do better. Yet John felt himself drawn towards them, even though he could reach the third layer. Was that something related to his perspective as an otherworlder? If so, was it good or bad? Tempering the growth of spiritual totems wasn't exclusive to the elemental seeds, just more difficult. He didn't want to go down the wrong path. So, he took advantage of his position to consult the strongest cultivator he knew, his grandfather, Tenebach. He explained his thoughts. And I'm not sure how to pick the right totem. I know it is unwise to delay too long, but making the wrong choice affects my entire path of cultivation. Luctus nodded, taking in John's explanations. A difficult decision. Here is my advice. Continue thinking on your problem. A cultivator's intuition can be very important, but you must make sure it is not a passing fancy. It is possible to take something suited to the user from a level below what the cultivator can achieve and make it just as good. But you must also determine that there is not anything else equally suitable and more powerful, or you will waste your potential. Luctus sighed. You, speaking of him as he was before, was always an awkward subject. The one good quality you previously possessed was confidence, if not skill, in cultivation. The claws of darkness were quite compatible with you. That may not be the case anymore, but I urge you to find something that fits so well. Once you have taken the time, I will be willing to consult with you on specifics of your intended spiritual totem. He nodded. Thank you, grandfather. He had been hoping his thoughts were just a passing fancy. After spending more time on the third spiritual layer, he found some darkness element totems that suited him even better than the dancing shadow. One didn't have a name that he could find, so he dubbed it Peaceful Night. Then there was the cave, a particularly appealing spiritual totem because it combined the elements of darkness the Tenebach clan was attuned to and the earthen spiritual energy of the stone conglomerate. But John couldn't help but find himself drawn to something that didn't fit at all. It was tangentially connected to darkness, but it was a contradictory spiritual totem. Dubbed simply Foul Air in his guide, it was representative of certain sorts of unbreathable air that would build up in a mine. However, air was aligned with light and not darkness, which would make it particularly difficult to use. Added that he would have only very limited access to cultivation and combat techniques that worked with air-type spiritual energy, and he wondered why he couldn't just ignore it. He returned once more to the library. Xianxia, the keeper of the library, inclined his head. Young master, it is good to see you return. Xianxia was actually sincere about that. This time, John had tracked down most of the books he'd never returned, and now that he was more confident with his position, he was willing to ask for advice on books. That made searching easier and made Xianxia happy, which was great. Thank you, keeper. John placed down some of the books he had borrowed. I believe I am finished with these. As for what I require next, I recall reading about elemental cultivation paths. Single elements were most popular, of course. Then there were the aligned elemental cycles. Some cultivators also focus on particular weapons and rely less on the elemental natures of their spiritual totems. I would like to read anything with more in-depth details on those sorts of things. Xianxia nodded. Of course, most of those will be in the limited section. He took John to the back. As the young master of the clan, there were no parts of the library off-limits to him. He was aware that there were a few books kept separately by his parents and some of the older generation, but he might even be able to get access to them if he had need. However, he had no desire to delve into any forbidden and dangerous techniques. This one might do. Xianxia pulled a thin book off the shelf and handed it to John. And perhaps this one. He pulled out a larger scroll, clearly quite old. If those do not have what you are looking for, this section here is most likely to have what you want, unless you change your method of inquiry. John nodded. Thank you very much for your assistance, Keeper. Being polite to people was good. Xianxia deserved the respect for his position or his knowledge or his cultivation, and altogether even more so. But John was doing his best to respect the normal servants as well. He still gave them orders, of course, but that was their job. If he was going to take on the responsibilities of power, he might as well get some of the benefits. The text Xianxia recommended had just what he needed. Though it was a bit hard to puzzle through the older scroll, it explained some details about cultivation paths that the small book was lacking in. Once he had finished perusing them, he set them down and considered. Was the decision he was making the right one? He couldn't know, but he couldn't pull himself away from the idea. In addition to single elemental paths, weapon paths, and aligned cycle paths, there was the idea of a full elemental path. In theory, a full elemental cycle was one of the optimal choices. Nobody could say for sure it was the most optimal, but it covered weaknesses quite well. In theory. In practice, it was rarely so useful. It was difficult. Elements were aligned with each other in different ways. With light were fire and air, and darkness supported earth and water. Any of those triplets were compatible with each other. Crossing over the triplets, however, made things much more difficult. There were two methods, the paths of supporting and overcoming. Water doused fire, fire scorched earth, earth withstood air, and air controlled water, completing the cycle. Light and darkness could fit in at various points. In the other direction was support. Earth let fire grow stronger. Fire could heat water into different states, which led to clouds in the air, which could rain to feed the earth, and such. It worked in theory. In practice, the beginning might be weaker, and even completing half a cycle required reaching the soul expansion phase, which was where his grandfather currently was. At that point, a cycle of aligned elements had completed, and a single elemental focus remained steady throughout. With proper resources and talent and some luck, the soul expansion phase might be reached by John's parents' age or even a bit earlier, but the support of the cycle wouldn't yet be showing its power and the lack of focus would dominate. The full cycle would require 3 more whole phases to complete, and it wasn't clear if it would be stronger than the others, perhaps more versatile. Even so, John was willing to try it, but he hesitated because he had a more ridiculous idea. The text he read presumed the cultivator would reach for the highest level of spiritual totem they could obtain. His idea was that picking the right totems from consecutive layers might support the path better. Maybe he was wrong, but he had a few in mind. But even if it worked, would it be better than anything else? He hated not knowing, and it would be too late to change his mind later. He couldn't bet on his meridians being damaged just enough to allow him to repair them, recultivate, and pick a new totem, and he didn't know of any other way to start over. Plus, there was the matter of time. In his position as Fortkran Tenebach, he didn't want to make important decisions all on his own. Even though it was his own cultivation, it didn't affect just him. His grandfather hadn't suddenly stopped being wiser. So even though he wanted to immediately run off and attempt his plan, he consulted his grandfather. He expected immediate rejection at the idea, which had no basis in anything but intuition. It wasn't like he was the first person to cultivate, and untold generations had tried what they thought was best. Luctus Tenebach remained silent after he finished his explanation. He was clearly thinking, so exercising patience was the right option. Finally, he spoke. You have a truly ambitious plan. However, it will make you weak. Being weak and ambitious is a dangerous combination. Fortkran bowed his head. I understand, grandfather. It was a foolish idea. As he turned to leave, his grandfather spoke behind him. Strength is everything in cultivation. If you are weak, you will suffer and struggle, and you may die. You may work harder than anyone else for the same result. A more difficult path does not necessarily lead to a greater reward. But I will not say your plan is entirely without merit. If you are wrong, you will be only half as strong as you should at the foundation phase. Maybe less. Consider this when you make your choice. Chapter 8. Darkness. The Sword of Darkness Before Dawn. A calming yet depressing time where only a few cars were on the road. John pulled into the parking lot of Brad's Burgers. Brad himself had never existed, but Umberto's Hamburgers was too long of a name for marketing. Or at least so said the man himself. John sighed as he entered the place. As fast food jobs went, he supposed it paid fairly well. It was just, he had higher expectations for himself, like finishing his degree and getting a real job. Not that what he was doing now wasn't work, but it wasn't a career. Sweeping floors and flipping burgers wasn't really something he wanted to do long term, but they'd been hiring and it was better than a big chain. The sizzle of the patties on the grill was satisfying, at least, and at this time of day the kitchen wasn't crowded. There wasn't much of a breakfast rush at burger joints, though John had been surprised at how many people dropped by and got actual burgers. They had a small breakfast menu as well as a few breakfast burgers which had things like eggs on top and different buns, and sometimes sausage patties. Umberto himself came into the kitchen, grabbing the burger spatula and flipping some patties. "That's 15 seconds too much on that side, Miller." John sighed. He didn't intend to let it happen, but it just came out. Umberto was nice enough, but he was very critical of work and extremely observant. "What's wrong, young man?" John couldn't help but be honest. "It's not a big difference. You correct me on every little thing, but ignore the others. Every time it's some little thing I'm doing wrong. Is that how you see it?" Umberto asked. He took a deep breath, flipping a few more patties and tossing others into buns, working as he spoke. "Perhaps it looked that way. The thing is, I already told them what they were doing wrong 100 times. If they're not going to fix it, why say it again? You fix whatever I tell you is wrong and get a little bit closer to perfect every time. You'll need to know exactly what makes things right in the future." John nodded, continuing his work as well, but couldn't help but say more. "Why does it matter if my work is slightly better when 90% of them are going to be the way everyone else does it? It's always important to have that little bit of extra quality," Umberto said. "And when I am not here, someone will have to know how to do things just right." "What do you mean?" John asked. Umberto might have been a tough boss, but he paid well and did more work than anyone else. He was there for opening and closing. John was too, but he needed the hours. "Did I not mention it yet?" Umberto tilted his head. "I'm opening a new location, so this place will need a manager." "What?" John asked. He wasn't sure if he heard right. "I thought you would sound happier. It's not really any more work, just a bit different. And the pay is much better. Are you saying you want me as manager?" "Of course. Why would I pick anyone but my hardest worker who knows how to make everything perfectly? Or close enough?" John breathed a sigh of relief. He physically couldn't work any more hours, but he couldn't search for a better-paying job either, even if he were qualified. Being promoted to manager? That would at least help the family make ends meet. John slowly breathed out a black fog, not a gross one filled with impurities, though he still found it unsettling. Cultivating was much different from how he thought any sort of magical or supernatural abilities would work. Then again, everything was different from what he thought before he tried it. This particular thing just happened to involve more thinking and meditation instead of throwing fireballs at things. Though some people could do that. He was currently in his peak state. Though reliving old memories left a bitter taste in his mouth, he was also filled with determination. There was no manager around him to tell him exactly the right way to do things, and to be honest, some people like their burgers done 15 seconds more or less. Everyone was different in tastes and styles, and what cultivation was best for them. John might not know what was best for him, but he had at least taken the time to attempt to figure it out. He couldn't go with anything but what he believed was the best. His essence rocketed to the first layer of the sea of spiritual totems. That was trivial, having done it so many times that he could even reach the third layer and stay for 10 or 20 minutes. Then he found himself in front of the seed of darkness. He hesitated for only a brief moment before reaching out, coaxing it to form a connection with him. Or maybe coaxing himself to form a connection with it. Was there a difference? The seed moved, gently flowing into him and sinking into his dantian. That was it. He thought it would be more momentous and dramatic, but as he carefully pulled himself out of the first layer, he found it was still inside him, just as it should be. Taking careful stock of his dantian, he saw the spiritual energy he had condensed flowing into the seed. It seemed like the seed might absorb everything he had if he let it. Perhaps he would, but in that case he needed to really give it everything. Was that the right way? He would have to actually monitor its progression, but it was part of him now. So far, at least, everything was going well. He began using his cultivation method, the one Fortkran had experience with. It was the best darkness element one the family had, and it still suited him. He absorbed spiritual energy from the world around him, already thickened by the formation underneath him in the training room. He took the energy through his meridians, a process which was beneficial to both the spiritual energy and those strange veins that carried it. The particular process aligned it better to the darkness element that he was suited for, had been made suited for, maybe, by the guardian beast. The seed happily absorbed the darkness elemental energy, filling up and up. Finally, he felt it reach its peak. He only had a few remaining wisps of energy, even after replenishing himself as much as he could. Then he waited, watching the seed. It was just a little point of darkness like a black hole, or what he imagined one would be like. Much less powerful, of course. As he watched a small wisp of darkness energy trickled out of the seed. As he touched it, he could feel it was much denser than the elemental energy he had put in. He had thought getting a spiritual totem would be like adding one to one, but he was wrong. He now understood how much Mateo had been holding back when they sparred. Instead of adding one to one, he felt more like he had added one to zero. Without the totem, his spiritual energy was nothing. Fortkran hadn't been that aware of his own power before the totem, so he hadn't noticed before. Of course, if he was now at a 1, she was at least a 6 or something. He knew she had at least 2 third-level spiritual totems, maybe better. She was still an entire phase ahead of him. A tide of water poured over him. He found himself forced back step by step, but each step he absorbed a little bit of the impact and even fortified himself with it. He was right about how much stronger Mateo was, but while he had traditionally lost completely to her, at least now she was serious about her actions. With a flick of his wrist, his sword took an invisible path towards her, striking her straight in the side, only for the momentum to be absorbed by the water elemental barrier around her. A moment later, her sword came up and touched the tip of his throat, poking through his own defensive barrier. John sighed. I lost again. Mateo lowered her weapon. Of course you did. I'm in the foundation phase. If I was matching your defensive level, I might have actually been injured by that. I underestimated you. That said, my final attack was something you should have been able to deal with. You put too much into your own attack and forgot defense. That's dangerous, especially if you don't defeat your opponent. John nodded. I know. I was just hoping to finally manage something before you left. Mateo turned around, her dark hair flowing down her back. Ambition can be good. Just make sure it doesn't get you killed. She paused as she was stepping away. Do you know why I came here? I thought it was something to do with the family, but I suppose it was about me, or how I was. You are correct. I came here to talk with your family about how we could break off the marriage without losing our alliance. Our grandfathers are longtime friends, after all. I didn't want to go against his specific wishes, but you. She turned her head over her shoulder, or at least who you were. I couldn't abide. But now I am. Content enough to leave things as they are. John didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. She turned her head back forward and said one final thing as she left. I will see you again in the future. I hope you were stronger, much stronger at that time. For both of our sakes. Chapter 9. No matter how much spiritual energy he fed the seed of darkness, it was happy to absorb it and trickle out more refined spiritual energy. The claws of darkness had required more work to refine spiritual energy, though with their position as a third-layer totem, the ultimate result had been stronger. Even so, John was happy to fill up his dantian with what he had. Mostly out of curiosity, he attempted another circulation of his cultivation technique with the already refined spiritual energy. The most immediate thing he noticed was that the effect on his meridians was more pronounced. The darkness had a chilling effect as it passed through. Not unpleasant, but like a cool glass of water on a hot summer day. The more powerful energy was partly absorbed into his meridians, tempering them. That was a necessary part of passing through the levels of cultivation. Even if he could somehow obtain stronger spiritual energy immediately, if his meridians and dantian couldn't handle it, he would be in a bad state. He already had experience with that, trying to break through to foundation phase too early. When the spiritual energy completed its circulation and returned to the seed, it once again absorbed it. The reabsorption was much slower, and the twice refined energy it slowly produced was only marginally different. Even so, every little bit counted for something. He continued cultivating until he had refined everything as much as he could, filling himself comfortably full of spiritual energy. Then he had other duties to attend to. With his previous experience cultivating, it only took 2 weeks to pass through all of the early stages of the spiritual collection phase. Soon enough, he was at the 4th level out of 9. Not an impressive accomplishment given his age of around 20 years old, but at least he was no longer almost powerless. The official story was that Fortkran Tenebach had an inspiration which caused him to choose to reset his cultivation and start over from the beginning. For all but the core members of the Tenebach clan, his parents, grandfather, and a pair of close uncles, that was the story they knew. Some might have suspected different, but they certainly wouldn't mention it. Now that he had a spiritual totem, he was able to spar with a wider variety of people. That started with cousins, and while it was somewhat humiliating to fight cousins a year or 2 younger than himself, they were about the right level for him to compete with. Some of them were at the 3rd level but with 2nd or 3rd tier spiritual totems, and he had to admit that he was more or less matched with them, sometimes inferior. He tried not to let it bother him. He had to relearn everything. His fighting style was new, even to his old self, and he was used to being stronger, or not fighting at all, respectively. With a spiritual totem from the 1st layer, he found it hard to compete in direct confrontation. It was fortunate that he had access to all of the family's library to pick out some technique that suited him. The first thing he had learned was a simple footwork technique, a more basic movement of a movement technique. Hidden Steps was the name, and it synergized well with the darkness element to make it hard to predict his movements. He was also studying a basic swordsmanship manual and spending time with trainers who had experience. He had yet to learn an actual martial technique with a sword, but he could at least coat his weapon in his spiritual energy to augment it, and he was more efficient about it now. The opponent who matched Fortkran most closely was Tempkite, a cousin just 1 year younger. He was similarly of the 4th level, and his spiritual totem was of the 1st layer. In short, he was considered a mediocre talent. Before John took over, Fortkran had thought nothing of him. Afterwards, he saw how hard he worked. Hard work wasn't everything in cultivation, but even if strength was important, a good personality was much nicer to have around. Tempkite didn't take any defeat personally, and when he won, he wasn't overly domineering. His totem was known as the Shadowed Palms, and he fought barehanded as well as Fortkran could fight with a sword. Even so, there was a bit of something lacking. Of course, the power wasn't much to speak for, but the more relevant part was the experience. It was likely there weren't many good sparring partners for him in the past, so he had to train on his own. With his mediocre talent, he was also not able to get much time with any trainers. That was the harsh reality of the situation. The Tenebach clan didn't have infinite resources, and so personal training was reserved only for those who would likely get the most out of it. As the young master of the clan, Fortkran had access to anything reasonable and sometimes unreasonable requests, though John had avoided those as much as possible after taking over. Spars with Tempkite were much different than facing Mateo. She was in the foundation phase, and while she had limited her offensive capacity, she kept her defenses. That meant Fortkran had to more precisely know the limits of his own strength as well as his opponent, so that they wouldn't injure each other. There were people on standby if there was an accident, and they indeed occasionally injured each other, but with spiritual energy defending them, they could reduce most of the damage. Fortkran's spiritual energy flowed around him in a thin layer. It wasn't weak, just condensed. When a palm struck him, the energy distributed the force of the blow around his body. In addition, he could absorb some of the attack's spiritual energy. He found it was easier with the darkness element, especially of family members, but he could do it with anything he'd encountered so far. He hadn't had the opportunity to test it with light elemental spiritual energy, but any such conflict would be quite destructive. As opposite elements, light and darkness would interact violently, more than any of the central elements. His sword swept through the air, barely reflecting light from the midday sun. Tempkite's palm came up, his fingers sliding the blade up and over his head. Even without gathered spiritual energy, his palms were empowered, able to withstand a moderate strike from a sword, with a small amount of spiritual energy and a sharp blade. Without using a weapon, his reach was less, but he was able to more quickly maneuver. In addition, the flow of energy around him was quicker. Fortkran wanted to force his sword back down, but the redirected momentum carried it up, and by the time his energy redirected it, he had missed. His feet carried him back and away, but he still had to use his arm to block a palm strike from Tenebach as he stepped forward inside his reach. He managed to gather enough energy that he would only bruise instead of breaking anything, and a small portion of the energy found its way to mingle with his own. He could use it, but it was a bit sluggish compared to the rest. He didn't have any sense that it was trying to hinder him, but merely that he didn't understand it as well. He figured he needed to get used to controlling it. So after taking a defensive stance and absorbing a few more strands of energy, he gathered it on his sword. It wasn't really to the credit of the spiritual energy that he slipped his attack past the attempted parries and into Tenebach's chest, and it barely held enough to pierce through most of the energy protecting his ribs, but he would likely be better the next time. Tenebach stepped back. "You are victorious once more, Fortkran." He bowed slightly. "I am afraid I have reached my limits for the day. I look forward to sparring with you again at the earliest opportunity." Something felt strange about how he spoke. It wasn't that his words were false, but they still felt unnatural. Then again, his status was much lower, so being overly polite was quite reasonable. Perhaps in the future they might break down that barrier of caution and have deeper interactions beyond just sparring. John found himself called to meet with his grandfather Luctus. Though the servant said to come at his earliest convenience, he knew that meant immediately unless he was in the middle of cultivating, or perhaps having wounds patched up. He still wasn't used to that, or the speed at which seemingly huge cuts could heal with medicines that had seemingly magical power. He didn't have any indication that magic was real in this world, but cultivation was certainly magical even if it wasn't magic. He was concerned about side effects of medicines, but he supposed that his body was also very different than on Earth. It would probably be fine. He knocked on the door, but even as his knuckles touched, he got a response. "Come in, Fortkran." As he stepped into his grandfather's room, he found him sitting at his table looking over some papers and having some tea. It was unlike any tea he had tasted on Earth, but it was certainly heated water infused with plants. Some of it he liked, and some he didn't, though he was certain it was all good. "I have heard your cultivation is progressing rapidly." "Yes, grandfather. My previous experience is quite helpful in that regard. I know how far I can push myself, and just being used to cultivating helps." "Good. Progress as much as you can. In 2 months, there's a competition we will have you join in. Control of an area high in spirit stones is the prize." He knew something about such competitions. If cultivators fought directly over every opportunity, the various sects and clans would wipe each other out in just a few years. There was no point in losing a foundation phase cultivator just to get the resources to raise another. While there were certainly lawless regions where the strong could take whatever they wanted, the stone conglomerate was an overall peaceful place, with rules in place to prevent too much fighting. Tournaments were a reasonable replacement for fighting and served to provide opportunities for younger generations. "I hadn't heard of this before. Is this a new region?" Luctus shook his head.
No.
Oh, even if he had been stronger before, he hadn't been informed of the tournament. Perhaps it was just because it had been early, but he got the feeling even if he was going to be chosen to participate before, he wouldn't know much ahead of time. Now he needed to properly prepare, and they felt it was better to let him know. "I will do my best to be as strong as possible when the time comes." "What are the restrictions?" "Below 23 years of age, and not yet in the foundation phase. There are other opportunities for your older cousins in the foundation phase, but you need not concern yourself with them." Luctus shook his head. "Truthfully, there is very little value to be found in winning. However, it is enough to motivate more clans to participate, so a better appraisal of the younger generation can be seen. There might be some large sects looking for potential members, but I will not look like much, even if I do well. The benefits for joining most sects around here won't be better than my position currently affords. Regardless, you understand. Perhaps if your plan works out as you intend, but as for the moment you appear to be mediocre to those on the outside. The most important thing is to understand your limits in the tournament. Even if you lose, we need to look good. If an opponent is too strong, surrendering early might be better. I'm sure you understand." "I do. Though I will at least attempt to surpass the first round or two." Chapter 10. A sword swung down towards Fortkran with the weight of 1,000 boulders, or at least 1 boulder and 1 very large man. Blocking the attack was a terrible idea, and even parrying it was extremely difficult. He managed a half-dodge, half-parry. The sword crashed into the ground, cleaving it apart. That left him a chance to counter with his own sword, striking for the throat of the man in front of him. Then his armpit was tapped by the enemy's sword. Very good, young Master Fortkran. The large man in front of Fortkran was Breg. He was the swordmaster of the Tenebach clan, and even though he was only a couple steps into the foundation stage at 30 years old, his swordsmanship left no question to his ability. Quite a few cultivators had met their ends, or at least their significant embarrassment, at his hands when they underestimated him for his relatively lower cultivation. You've improved greatly. Fortkran nodded. Thank you. I feel much more confident. So, what did I do wrong? As I said, you've improved greatly. You could have cut off my arm before my blade reached you. You didn't even go past my cultivation level. Breg scratched the back of his head. Well, I do have a second spiritual totem. That empowers me quite a bit. Look, you're not paid to compliment me. The thought flashed through his mind that perhaps he was, to some degree. I need you to make me as strong as possible. I thought that was a perfect time for a counter, with your sword digging into the ground. But obviously it wasn't. All right, it was a feint. You have to know I'm an earth element cultivator. Bouncing my sword off the ground isn't so difficult. It might seem like an overswing that will lose all momentum, but instead it comes back in a snap. You can tell by reading the way my energy was arranged. Too much on the backside of the sword that was never going to connect with you, so I can have enough power on the reverse. Then there was the way it was always planned to reflect off the ground, though that's a more subtle thing than the quantities of energy. Fortkran nodded. I'll have to watch for that. Should I step in more? That can do it. I more or less make it go straight back along the trajectory it was on, with only small deviations. Someone else might do better, though. You might instead strike my arm, with it extended so far. I understand. What else? Even tiny things. I need to know what you see so I can fix it. Well, as long as you're asking, your stance was a smidge narrow. The angle of your blade was off for that particular guard, and you telegraph your attacks too much. Even if all I know is that you're attacking and not how with your darkness element aiding you, it helps me. He would need to keep training with Breg every day. He would also train with his grandfather on the darkness side of things. Then there was cultivating on his own, increasing his base level of power. He had an actual goal in the tournament. He needed to be as good as possible. Winning would be desirable, but probably not realistic. At best, he might return to the 5th or 6th level by that time, a significant margin weaker than peak 9th level cultivators. That wasn't counting they might have higher tier totems. Though, he could feel the seed of darkness advancing. It might be equivalent to a full 2nd tier before he reached foundation phase, or maybe it would be slightly after. Judging how long either would take was sort of nebulous. It had taken 5 years to first reach the 9th level of cultivation, but he was fairly certain he could do it in 1 or 2 now. Experience paid off, even if it wasn't his experience. In private, John wondered if he had been too ambitious. The thought that he could be twice as powerful as he was now if he'd just made a different choice grated on him. But he couldn't help it. For his first life, he'd first been drifting along a gentle current until a storm hit. Then he'd merely been trying to hold on. He hadn't become a manager at Brad's Burgers because that was his life goal. He'd done it because that was where he'd ended up. He put in the effort, but it wasn't the best place he could have ended up. Umberto was a good boss, and it wasn't a bad job, but he'd been getting a college education before that. He was going to be something, a so-called real job. Though managing a restaurant, even a fast food place, was also a real job. But if he was going to do it, he wanted even more. Umberto hadn't stopped at one location, and perhaps he shouldn't either. That was why he planned to complete a full elemental cycle. Even just getting halfway meant he'd have to pass where his parents currently were, and then he'd have to surpass his grandfather. Could he really make up for 80 years and more? John decided not to worry about it. There was a saying, shoot for the moon, and if you miss you'll land among the stars. Of course, realistically someone would end up in wide open space. Technically just as among the stars as anywhere else. But motivational phases weren't supposed to be literal. If he planned to complete a full elemental cycle and only managed to reach late foundation phase in 20 or 30 years, he would still not be an embarrassment to his family. If he reached soul expansion phase at all, he could be content. The step beyond that was the consolidated soul phase. If he made it there, then the clan he now found himself a part of could be very proud. Beyond that, there weren't enough cultivators in the stone conglomerate that had reached that level for it to have a set name. Even the names for the other stages were generic, but not entirely accepted. Earth cultivators might go by Pebble, Boulder, Hill, and so on. However, the fifth phase could be called anything from Brilliant Radiance, Mountain, Demigod, or something like the Pure Spirit phase, or just the fifth phase, which was easiest to understand. Some people like that existed, but that was too far off to consider, even though his lifespan would increase as his cultivation did. In short, he'd planned out a full elemental cycle and would carry it as far as he could. Maybe he'd change his mind at Foundation phase if he found a totem that perfectly suited him in a higher layer, but somehow he wasn't sure if he could afford to do that. He might feel like he failed. Then again, he could consider that before doing anything. In the short term, he had a tournament to win, or at least avoid making a terrible display of the clan. He'd siphon some earth elemental spiritual energy in his matches with Brake. As he circulated the small remnants he hadn't used in battle through himself, he felt it absorb into his meridians, tempering them. It was a slightly different feeling than the darkness he had, but he didn't have enough to learn more. The same was true with Mateo's water elemental energy. At most a few % of his total had been a different element, and it was all gone after the first cycle. Once he was at his peak, he pulled out the technique scroll for Gravity Blade. With a name like that, one would expect that he would be manipulating one of the fundamental forces of nature. While his family had access to fairly good techniques, anything made for those at the spiritual collection phase was a bit more modest. The exact effect wouldn't be apparent until he actually was able to perform the technique, but the basic description was that it would add force to his blows among other things. He circulated his spiritual energy through the prescribed path to eventually reach his hands, where it then extended to his sword. It was much too slow to be used in combat like this, but he did feel something more than just the normal darkness element on his sword. He gave it a swing. It felt sluggish, like someone was trying to hold it in place. As it was, he doubted he would hit harder. He could barely even make it move, and striking someone who was at all aware of him would be difficult. However, he could certainly refine the technique, both his formation and control of it afterwards. Then he would know whether or not he was wasting his time. But he doubted that a truly worthless technique would be in the Tenebach library, especially one of the darkness element, which they could easily vet for basic functionality. All he had to do was keep practicing, so he could see how this gravity actually worked. Chapter 11. When inside the bounds of dealing with his new family, he was Fortkran Tenebach. Having a second name was like having a weird nickname he hadn't chosen. Then again, he hadn't chosen his actual name, so he probably just needed time to get used to it. Either way, his body at least was able to pick out his name properly, so he heard his name get called. He had been watching the early matches, checking out potential future opponents. Now, it was his turn to fight. He was nervous, because this would be his first real fight. The chance of dying was very low. The tournament had protections set up so that people were extremely unlikely to actually die. But this would be his first fight in his new life where someone didn't have his best interests in mind. They would just want to win, not to make him better. He stepped up to the arena, a fairly plain stone square about 10 meters on a side. It had enough room for spiritual collection phase cultivators to maneuver around, though those who preferred long-range tactics would be somewhat at a disadvantage. Fortkran hadn't paid enough attention to notice the other name that was called out until he stepped up and his memories recognized Xianxia's. The Xianxia's clan was similarly made up of darkness element cultivators, but the relations between them and the Tenebachs was not friendly in the slightest. The man in front of him was about the same age, somewhere in his early 20s, but he was somewhat larger than Fortkran. He knew muscle didn't matter that much in cultivation, but size was still intimidating. Still, he wouldn't let that show. When Xianxia stepped up on stage, he immediately had something to say. So it is true, you failed in cultivation and dropped back from where you were. It seems the Tenebach clan isn't so great after all. Fortkran had many things he wanted to say in response, even though Xianxia was technically right. However, anything he said might be overconfident. He'd only managed to reach the 6th level of the spiritual collection phase, and Xianxia was in the 7th. Along with that, his spiritual totem was of the 2nd tier. Not a particularly impressive resume, yet better than what Fortkran had. So he said nothing, because even if he lost at least, he would only be a minor embarrassment. No reply might have indicated timidity, but he didn't plan to be timid in the actual match. As soon as the referee called for the match to start, Fortkran sprang forward. Jurgely had a warhammer and shield, a common combination of weapons in the stone conglomerate. Darkness wasn't inherently suited to hammers, but Jurgely's spiritual totem or just his training might have made it a better choice. Certainly, he couldn't criticize someone for picking what suited them. 2 steps from where he could attack, Fortkran activated hidden steps, quickly moving around to the side where Jurgely held his hammer. His sword came down, coated in energy. Despite the awkward angle, Jurgely managed to react and parry with his warhammer, swinging around to swipe at Fortkran with his shield. The two of them exchanged blows, their energy clashing. Fortkran was unable to get any real advantage with his early gambit, but he also didn't lose out. He was still taking stock of his opponent when he felt Jurgely gathering more energy for an attack. The arena around them was covered in darkness, and some portion of it concentrated on the hammer. Dodging the attack without being able to see would be difficult, but Fortkran could see. Swirling darkness didn't impede his sight to any serious degree, as part of the blessing from the family's guardian beast. The attack was made with the confidence that it would be unseen, but instead he gathered energy for his own technique. He wasn't so used to fighting against a hammer, but the trajectory of one wasn't much different from a sword, and Brague was 1,000 times more skillful. Even if Fortkran could barely do anything against Brague, with Gravity Blade he latched his sword to the hammer, pulling it even more strongly along its path while making sure it didn't hit him. The hammer crashed into the ground and was pulled out of Jurgely's hand. Fortkran instantly followed up by reversing the direction of his swing, not with the same explosive power he'd seen before, but quick enough to catch his opponent off guard. The shield came up, Jurgely's energy preventing him from cutting it in two. He pulled away, but took a little bit of the energy with him. He wasn't so experienced that he could say for certain, but the darkness energy he got seemed less pure than the rest that he had encountered among his clan. Then again, while the Xianxia's clan somewhat considered themselves rivals to the Tenebachs, they really weren't. The previous Fortkran shouldn't have ever found himself in a match with Jurgely. Fortkran added his own darkness to the arena, and as thin as it was, he clearly had more effect on his opponent. He managed to slip around behind him, and when Jurgely looked around for him and decided to dash for his weapon, he slashed at him from behind. Jurgely's energy wasn't condensed enough to prevent his slash, and Fortkran's sword cut through it and the thin armor underneath. If the formations of the arena hadn't activated, it might have cut even deeper through flesh and bone. He could have killed someone. The thought was somewhat unpleasant for a person who hadn't gotten into anything more violent than a fist fight, but it was quickly tempered by the exhilaration of winning. Besides, he hadn't killed him. The referee could clearly sense things sufficiently through the 2 layers of darkness energy, declaring Fortkran the winner. Jurgely was barely able to walk out of the arena, but as he was going, Fortkran managed to say something. "No matter what changed with my cultivation, you should have considered if your own was good enough first." Yes, that seemed good enough. It didn't admit much of anything, and was somewhat insulting to the loser without going too far. Well, perhaps he would get more practice with that. First, though, he would have to win more. While he couldn't say he won easily, he was able to make up for the difference in raw power by better technique. He couldn't say that it was his own personal skill at play, but rather the fact that he had the personal attention of many skilled teachers, including his soul expansion phase grandfather. Fighting against any lesser-trained darkness with worse weapon techniques than Brague felt easy. At least it seemed his efforts had paid off. The next match was later the same day against an earth cultivator. That was entirely expected, being one of the most prominent cultivation types in the country. This opponent was a woman, Cosima Valdez. There was no real grudge between their clans, but of course both sides would try their best to win. Fortkran had seen her previous match, and she had probably seen his. Even with the darkness from both him and Jurgely, she should have at least picked up some idea of how he fought. She carried a thin staff, but Fortkran knew not to underestimate it. It was thin, but made out of stone, and he'd seen her knock her previous opponent out of the ring with it, throwing him a total of 5 meters. The ring out was a loss, even if her opponent had somehow been able to stand with all of the broken ribs. Fortkran politely bowed his head and got the same in return. Then the match began. The two circled each other, looking for openings. The staff had more reach than a sword, but that didn't mean it couldn't be used up close. A cut was more damaging than a strike in most cases, but that required him to land a solid blow, and it wasn't guaranteed. Cosima was the first to unleash a few careful strikes, not committing to anything but instead testing Fortkran's guard. He felt the weight of her staff, both its natural weight and the enhancement from the earth energy. She seemed more skilled than his previous opponent, but he couldn't lose to her. Not because she was a woman, though there was certainly still some sexism in this world, but because he was from a large clan and was expected to reach at least the third or fourth round. As the young master of the clan, it would be disappointing if he couldn't reach the finals, but he at least couldn't lose in the second round. Fortkran had to be careful with how he moved. Hidden steps might prevent his opponent from instantly recognizing where he moved, but in her previous match he had seen her throw someone off balance without even touching them. He flashed around to the side, attempting to get past her guard. As soon as he moved, he saw her slam the butt of her quarterstaff down to the ground, and he felt the earth tremble. He nearly fell over, and indeed, if he had committed to his attack, he would have lost his balance. Instead, his movement had been a feint that he might have been able to turn into an actual attack if she hadn't reacted at all. Now he just needed to figure out how to deal with her technique, and perhaps he could pull out the win. With no enmity between the two of them, it felt much like a spar. He wanted to win, but he wanted to learn even more. It was actually sort of fun. Chapter 12. The best techniques Fortkran had worked when his opponents directly interacted with him. Absorbing some of their energy, while minor, gave him an advantage. He could redirect their attacks with Gravity Blade and try to disarm them. When Cosima shifted the ground around underneath his feet, he just had to rely on foot techniques to keep himself steady. At least he'd had the basics drilled into him over and over, even if that particular occurrence hadn't come up. The one advantage that Fortkran had was his opponent eventually had to attack. She found a good enough opening to take a swing at him, and he used Gravity Blade to parry while his sword slipped down her staff, controlling her movement with his energy and what muscle he had to prevent the quarterstaff from coming down on his shoulder. There was enough force behind it he knew his energy couldn't withstand the blow, but he managed to avoid the attack and bring his sword to bear on Cosima. As his sword slid down her staff, she had to let it go to prevent her hands from being sliced, and even as she stepped away, his sword tore through her thick, defensive energy. "I surrender," Cosima called out. Fortkran stopped his follow-up attack. The match was his, though he couldn't say it had been easy. He'd had to push himself to the limits to not get struck by the attack to his shoulder, or really, targeted at his head so that even dodging he'd likely get hit on the shoulder. So far, Fortkran had done a good job representing the Tenebach clan. Even if he was only in the 6th level of the spiritual collection phase, his performance was good enough that it was overlooked. However, training and determination would only take him so far against opponents also determined to win, and with better cultivations. His next opponent was a sturdy woman with a rarely seen element. At least, in the stone conglomerate, she was a fire-type cultivator, which wasn't unheard of, but one of the few in the tournament. Fire didn't innately overcome darkness. It would overcome earth and be weak to water, but against darkness, who had the advantage relied on who had the higher cultivation. Of course, a higher cultivation was always better, but it wasn't unlikely for a cultivator with an elemental advantage to overcome a few levels of difference in cultivation with all other factors being equal. Fire and darkness weren't directly related in the cycle, but each could overcome the other with increased efficiency if there was a difference in power. Fortkran could sense that his opponent, Mora, was in the 8th level of the spiritual collection phase. There was little hope for him to win, especially since he had never fought a fire-type cultivator before, and Mora had certainly faced darkness cultivators. All the advantages of his extra training and the affinity boost from the family's guardian beast meant nothing with a big enough gap in power. It wouldn't be too shameful if he lost, or even if he gave up beforehand. But this was a good opportunity. He'd never fought a fire cultivator before, but he readied his sword against her twin axes. Fire was near the end of his list if he intended to complete a full cycle of elements in his cultivation, but it was never too early to learn something, especially since he might face more opponents of the sort outside of a tournament. As she moved, her axes left trails of fire in the air. Those weren't just for effect, but Fortkran could feel heat from the trails of flame. Thus, even if he dodged an attack, it prevented him from carelessly moving in for a counter. Fighting against two weapons was new to him, but his trainers had occasionally used their fists or feet to attack when he focused too much on their weapons. With spiritual energy, A fist wasn't necessarily less dangerous than a sword. He could parry one axe and dodge another as long as he stayed light on his feet. Even during their brief exchanges, he could feel his sword heating up. He dispersed the fire elemental energy, absorbing just a bit of it inside him. The mixture of fire and darkness was like lying in the sun with his eyes closed and equally pleasing. But he didn't have much time to dwell on it. He could tell he was exerting more of his energy to disperse more as fire than she was, which meant he was already on the back foot. He could try to look for a good opening before he ran too low on energy, but he opted instead to prolong the battle as much as possible, keeping up his defensive tactics. Instead of dispersing the fire directly away from his blade, he found if he waited for another attack, he could also force it back on his opponent. That worked twice, before she took advantage of her better control of the fire to double up on the power. His sword nearly melted in his hands, except not really. His palms were nearly burning even with the wrap separating him from the tang of his sword, and he was sweating not just from exertion, but from the heat encompassing the arena. He ducked under a swing, directly blocking the other axe with his sword. With gravity blade and the advantage of two hands, he pulled one axe away from her, sending it sliding across the arena. But he found she was nearly as good with a bare hand as with an axe. It was just lacking in reach. With the advantage of 2 cultivation levels, she wasn't even afraid to deflect his sword with her bare hand. Bare except for a thick coating of fire elemental spiritual energy, of course. Forktran longed for the peaceful chilling he normally felt from the darkness inside of him, but it was too overwhelmed. He at least managed to hold his ground for a few minutes further before his sword was knocked off target by her axe and her flaming fist reached his chest, even as he attempted to dodge. The fire burned through his spiritual energy, his armor, and his flesh, though not terribly deep. The arena's defenses came to his aid, and she hadn't actually tried to kill him. Even so, the burns were one of the most painful things he had experienced, behind damaged meridians, but more than anything in his former world. One advantage of being a young master from a sizable clan was that he had access to good medicine. After the match, he was taken aside and quickly had cooling ointment applied to the burns. The doctor assured him the wounds were only superficial and would heal cleanly, but they served as a gentle reminder to him of his mortality. He had fought in a tournament, but in the future he might be asked to fight in a real battle, perhaps to the death, if it came down to that. He knew the Tenebach clan had no immediate plans to throw him into something they thought he wouldn't survive, but if he was going to be a part of them, he had to do his share. His grandfather Luctus came to him after the doctor left. An adequate performance. More than adequate, given your current cultivation level. Thank you. I thought I was improving a lot. And perhaps I was, but I realize now how much further I have to go just in the spiritual collection phase. Fortkran circulated the energy inside of him, which reinvigorated his body and helped soothe his wounds. The tidbits of fire energy he collected were carefully touched to the seed of darkness, and he felt for adverse reactions. However, it readily absorbed the fire, growing slightly. It wasn't something he could actually measure, but it was similar to a few days of cultivation. He would love to absorb more different elements, but trying more than tiny amounts of them was risky. Even though you did well, Luctus continued, be aware that people will still remark about the young master of the Tenebach clan losing to someone at the 8th level of the spiritual collection phase. It was known that you were previously close to foundation phase, but do not mind the words spoken about you. Only be aware of who is saying what and why. Some will think us weak, and you will need to continue growing to prove them wrong. Luctus sighed. If you had embarked on the most speedy path of cultivation with a 3rd-tier totem, you likely could have won several more battles. However, all that is important is that you continue to grow. Luctus closed his eyes, and Fortkran could see and feel his darkness energy flowing over him. You are growing quite well, and the seed of darkness seems like it will properly mature under your care. Let your successes and setbacks in this tournament remind you to keep working hard in your cultivation. There will be many more important things in the future, and I can say that even as you grow in success, so too will our expectations grow. He nodded. That was how this world was. Cultivation was about continuous growth, and if a cultivator stagnated, they lost much of their value. However, even without the reminder, growing stronger was personally satisfying. Perhaps it might not be enough to push himself through the hardest moments without other motivations, but being able to measurably compare his increases was extremely satisfying. He was also motivated to be stronger so that he wouldn't get injured again, or at least, that future injuries would be reduced as much as he was able. Chapter 13. Though he had been defeated and dropped out of the tournament, Fortkran would be remaining to watch the final rounds. There were several reasons. Firstly, that he had come with his family and had no desire to walk back to the Tenebach estate on foot. Going by carriage was much more pleasant, especially since they had an enchanted carriage and particularly fast iron-hoofed horses. He wasn't sure if their hooves were actually iron, but they certainly had a metallic sheen to them. Another reminder he was now in a different world. The more practical reason to stay was that watching battles was good for his training, not as good as fighting himself, but he could glean something from seeing people stronger than him fight. Everyone remaining in the tournament was either 8th or 9th level in the spiritual collection phase. Though Fortkran had seen better techniques, there was something about real matches instead of sparring that brought out the best in people. Besides, watching his foundation phase parents train was a bit much. Their movements were too quick to keep up with, so he didn't learn much. His grandfather was another stage ahead of them and didn't have many people he could reasonably train with. Not nearby, anyway. A 9th stage Earth cultivator from the Emerson clan won. Stuart Emerson was one of the favorites for the tournament, so nobody was surprised. If Fortkran had not dropped in cultivation, he might have been a match with his 3rd-tier spiritual totem, but then again, he wouldn't have even known about the tournament. His family hadn't been willing to include him as he was before, or as the previous person in his body was. He was certainly a different person, but his memories were still around, ready to present themselves as appropriate. While useful, Fortkran found that remembering things was often inconvenient despite its utility. He just wished some of the things he remembered hadn't happened, but he couldn't exactly change that. Thus was the case when a young man about his age appeared in front of him. Fortkran vaguely recognized him, but as he spoke, the memories came flooding back. "I have come upon you at last, Fortkran Tenebach." The young man spoke from outside the family's box, which they had not yet departed after the conclusion of the final match. The man possessed the most common earth elemental spiritual energy from Marble County. "I have been training for the past years to outmatch you, and now it appears I have reached my goal. I demand a duel for the injustices you inflicted upon my sister." To Fortkran's chagrin, that information didn't tell him enough to properly identify the man in front of him. He really preferred avoiding thinking about his past when he didn't have to, because it reminded him why the family was so willing to just replace him with someone they didn't even know. That was convenient for John, but it didn't mean there were no problems that would bother him from the past. Like this, fortunately, the young man continued. "I am Kairos Tamasin, and I invoke the official right of the duel with Fortkran Tenebach." There were a number of things to process with that statement. First, that name. There was certainly a Tamasin he remembered, presumably the man's sister. There had been inappropriate advances made when he was drunk once, and later when he wasn't drunk. However, things hadn't gone further than that. That was good, because he wasn't sure if he was ready to handle some of the more serious situations. But a formal challenge for a duel still required a response. He could refuse, but that wouldn't look good. It would either be an admission of weakness or guilt. Losing would be bad as well, and the man in front of him was 8th level of the spiritual collection phase, and his aura didn't indicate he had a low-tier spiritual totem. He would be difficult. He felt the eyes of his family on him. He could refuse, but he didn't think that would resolve the situation in the best possible way. "Very well. In order to defend my honor, I accept your challenge. In 1 month's time, we shall have a standard duel here in the arena." A standard duel was not a death match. Though there could certainly be serious injuries, the arena's defenses would do their best to prevent death. 1 month was the longest a duel could be delayed without the consent of both parties, and he doubted that the man would be willing to wait. Very well. Kairos Tamasin deflated slightly when it was clear he wouldn't get to duel immediately, but he knew the official rules just as well as any. In 1 month's time. With that, he turned to leave. Though the Tenebach clan had many cultivators who could easily subdue him, in a city and following proper protocol, there wasn't much they could do. Not that it would look good for anyone beyond his stage to get involved, unless he actually attacked. Fortkran sighed. He knew his parents would want an explanation, Or maybe they already knew about the incident in question. Either way, they would speak on it later. Confronting Tenebach, Fortkran's father, stood across from him on the training field. While the current controller of the body wasn't responsible for what had happened, he had to deal with the consequences. The family had agreed that the duel was the most appropriate course of action. Not that they could have backed out at this stage, but winning was important. That meant training, and training meant difficulties. Confronting Tenebach favored a steel whip, a very difficult to deal with weapon. When controlled with energy, it could move however the user pleased, though it was still affected by normal laws of physics. However, just because it had momentum in one direction didn't mean energy couldn't be expended to immediately pull it in the other. Fortkran found that to be true many times in a row. Once more they prepared themselves, and Fortkran moved forward, taking a proper stance. Even though his father had lowered his level of output to slightly above Fortkran, he found himself unable to keep up. He could barely match the movements of the whip, and it almost immediately twisted around the base of his sword and yanked it out of his hands. Even using his own energy to try to maintain his grip didn't help. However, he did pull away the barest traces of his father's energy. He would later be able to feel it and inspect it to try to advance his own cultivation more quickly, which he needed to do. If he didn't reach the 7th level within the next month, his chances of winning the duel were very low. Though he had no weapon, Fortkran was not without the ability to defend himself. In some ways, it was easier to move without a weapon, because his spiritual energy moved throughout his own body much more easily than on a weapon. He used his energy to slap away the whip as it came towards him, then grabbed onto another section, yanking on it. Even as it twisted out of his grasp, he kept control over it for a brief section with what he had learned from using Gravity Blade. Then he was struck by the whip. His energy shook, nearly breaking. It could have been broken, but this was for training. He wasn't supposed to be truly injured. But if he didn't do his best, he would indeed end up hurt. As the familiar energy struck him again, he tried to direct it around his body instead of letting it concentrate in a single point. His success varied, but he kept his feet long enough to step forward and attempt an elbow strike. Wisps of darkness rose around him in front of his father's eyes, but they didn't successfully obscure his vision. Why would it? He had the same blessing of the family's guardian beast and could see through darkness, especially that of someone much weaker. Fortkran still tried, though. He had to be able to change something such that it would work. This time, it just ended up with him completely wrapped up by a whip, slowly getting crushed. He gritted his teeth, resisting the pressure as long as he could. His bones creaked and his energy trembled throughout him, flowing out from his dantian into his meridians until he was run dry. Right before everything fell apart, he spoke. "I surrender." His father nodded, and the whip loosened. "That is enough for now. Continue your cultivation. Remember that you absolutely cannot lose this duel." He nodded. His life might not be on the line, but that didn't mean it wasn't an important part of his future in jeopardy. If he didn't show enough improvement, his family might be willing to dispose of him like their previous son. He hoped they would be more sympathetic than that, and the original Fortkran had truly crossed the line too many times. But it was a bit hard to fit in with his new family. Chapter 14. It was late when John got home. It always was. After he had taken the manager position, he went in early and came home late. He hadn't really noticed, but that was the same as Umberto had done. It was also a lot more work than it seemed each hour, and with more of them, John sighed. At least the pay was good enough. He needed every bit he could get. They were barely staying on top of bills as it was. Kyle was still awake, sitting in front of the television. "I noticed you didn't show up for work again today," John started. "I can't pay you if you don't show up, and honestly, with your inconsistency, I would have fired you if you were anyone else. Do you know how hard it is to get someone to fill in a shift without notice?" Kyle looked over at him from the couch. "Sorry. Flipping burgers isn't exactly my idea of a dream job." "No shit," John snapped. "Do you think I wanted to drop out of college and flip burgers myself? While you guys are staying here, the least you could do is show up to work instead of staying home watching television all day." "Sorry." Kyle turned off the TV and stood up. "I'll make sure to show up on time for my shifts." "Good." John watched as Kyle walked away. He sighed. Somehow, he'd forgotten to eat even though he worked with food all day. Maybe he'd have cereal. He grabbed a bowl, half filled it with cereal before the box ran out, and poured the last bit of milk that was even less sufficient than the amount of cereal. He sat down heavily at the table, shoveling the food into his mouth. As he sat, he noticed the newspapers splayed out all over the table. They didn't have a paper delivered, but there were still places to get them. There were several papers, actually, all opened. Parts of them were circled. Jobs as a handyman, electrical engineer, IT, anything that vaguely fit Kyle's skills. Any would pay better than working at Brad's Burgers. However, the number of them that were X'd out indicated that there hadn't been any success. John glanced over at the couch, where he imagined the old laptop also had job search sites open. Having found out he was at least partly wrong to yell at his cousin didn't make him any less angry, just less sure where to direct it. He breathed out, slowly, his breath a smoking cloud of darkness. It had been unsettling to see that when it first started happening, but now it was normal. John, for he was. John, even if he had to deal with Fortkran's problems, found that old memories often resurfaced when he was cultivating. It threw him off until he dealt with them somehow. Now that he could actually do anything now, but he could at least consider things from a more removed perspective. Things had been pretty bad sometimes, but at least they'd held on. Right now, he had something more frustrating to deal with. His life was probably not at risk, but he had problems the former owner of his body had left behind. He doubted this would be the only one to resurface, just the first. It was easier to, really, attack Brague when John imagined he was swinging at Fortkran. That was who was responsible for the whole mess. After all, not himself and not Kairos. Kairos was probably in the right with the whole thing, but it wasn't possible to just let him have his way. While they used different weapons, Brague was still the best opponent for John to fight against considering the elemental types. He wasn't as overwhelming as Confronting Tenebach, which was surprising considering he was still in the next phase, a full 5 levels ahead. That didn't mean it was easy, but at least he felt like he had the slightest bit of a chance to land a blow. He knew channeling his anger into attacks wasn't productive, but it was better to do it in a safe environment than lose his head in the actual duel. By now, Brague's sword bounding off of the ground at him was nothing new. He dodged the initial attack and the rebound, stepping in when Brague overswung backwards. His sword slashed along his ribs, only barely cutting through the man's defensive energy, and then Brague's larger sword was slicing down at him at terrifying speeds. Only a hurried execution of hidden steps allowed him to dodge out of the way, but the shockwave as the attack hit the ground still knocked him off his feet. Not bad, young master. Brague held out his hand to lift John up, but that was a false opening. John sighed. Your sword repelled off the ground behind you too. No wonder you overswung so much. He took the hand and stood up. I thought I had you. To be fair, you almost did. You recognized the opening and took it immediately. If you had been slower, it would have been dangerous, but at that speed, you could have turned my feint into a real opening. You just needed a bit more behind your weapon. John cracked his neck. My swordsmanship isn't quite there yet. My best hope is my cultivation. I should be able to break through to 7th level in time. Good. That won't make you safe, but it will certainly help. For the rest of the month, he cultivated and sparred, mostly against Brague. He learned that when fighting a stronger opponent, it wasn't possible to just hope to match them and wear them down. He needed decisive blows, without leaving himself open. He wasn't sure how he'd done with that, but his secondary objective had gone well. He'd broken through to the 7th level, and perhaps equally importantly, he had much more practice absorbing earth energy. Brague had to have noticed him doing it by now, but he hadn't commented. Then again, what was he going to say about the young master's cultivation choices? His parents and grandfather were more qualified to speak to him there. It felt like cheating to show up to the match with new armor and a sword from the family's vault. However, he'd had enough of being poor in his previous life. He might as well take advantage of the wealth he had now while he could. Beating down someone less fortunate than him who was probably justified wasn't exactly something he wanted to do. But to even make that a consideration, he had to actually win. Besides, he wasn't planning to kill the man. Kairos stood across from him, wielding an axe in one hand and a shield in the other. In general, earth cultivators liked big, weighty weapons. They fit their attributes well, but John hoped he could take advantage of those particular attributes. The arena's referee announced the 2 participants. Kairos Tamasin brings grievances against Fortkran Tenebach, which shall be settled by this duel. Begin. John moved quickly. He wasn't really Fortkran. He just needed to keep his family's honor intact, and he preferred not to be injured as well. He hoped to catch Kairos flat-footed, but his sword was blocked by the shield. He moved around to that side to avoid the axe swinging in retaliation and began to look for openings. Kairos was 8th level, near the peak of the spiritual collection phase. John was just one step behind him, but his spiritual totem was of the 1st level. It was growing, but it certainly couldn't match a 2nd-tier totem yet. Kairos had at least that, perhaps a 3rd-tier totem. John found Kairos to be much less skilled than Brake. That was obviously going to be the case, but the fact that he was being seriously attacked instead of taught made up for some of it. He parried attacks that came too close, siphoning as much extra energy as he could. He had it in mind to take an Earth Elemental spiritual totem at the Foundation phase, for his next step in his optimistic cycle of elements. He didn't have an affinity for it yet, but he'd gotten used to it. He could slip a little bit of it into his attacks to provide extra momentum or around his feet for more stability. He didn't know what Kairos' spiritual totem was. He couldn't discern a special feature, which might have meant it was just for basic empowerment. Hopefully that was the case. He continued stepping around Kairos, whose feet remained relatively still. It wasn't a disadvantage for him, however, but merely part of his style. He turned as necessary to face the man he thought was Fortkran, each swing of his axe coming uncomfortably close. Then one went slightly wide. Unlike with Brake, the attack wasn't vertical, there was no earth to reflect off of, and that meant reversing the momentum would take the full effort expected. He slapped the axe even further wide with a quick application of gravity blade, his sword pushing back towards Kairos. His neck was open, but John aimed for his shoulder instead. He cut through the armor, and the tip of his sword sunk into flesh before clanking against bone. Not nearly as deep as he had imagined. So that was it. Stone bones. One of the most basic, but still quite effective spiritual totems of the 2nd layer. It wouldn't mean a literal transformation of Kairos' bones into rock, but they would be extremely sturdy, and it came with a general toughness improvement, enough that the man didn't seem to mind pushing against his sword to try to tackle him to the ground. He should have gone for the neck. Chapter 15. As Kairos rushed towards John, he tried to keep his sword pressing into the shoulder as the somewhat larger man jumped on him. His sword sliced along the bone, but it didn't deter the man, unable to cut through them. If John had been willing to potentially kill, he might have been able to cut deep enough into his neck to bring him down, but he couldn't give up his old-world morals just yet. It didn't help that Fortkran had been in the wrong, though he wasn't sure the actions deserved such brutality. Kairos' axe came down right next to John's head. It would have been through his head, but he found himself to be extra flexible when he needed to be. Even so, he was now pinned underneath the man, and the axe in the ground prevented him from dodging in that direction. A fist the size of a shot put slammed down into his face. His nose shattered, and the back of his head felt like it cracked. Darkness spiritual energy kept his head from being crushed, but he was seeing stars, and he was fairly certain it wasn't night yet. His eyes didn't do much good at the moment, but he felt the other hand grab him by the neck, and then the same fist come crashing down towards him again. Somehow, he wasn't worried about dying, though it was a possibility. Instead, he was using it as a learning opportunity. He couldn't move, and darkness wasn't right to resist a direct attack. He needed something else, and the only other element he had access to was earth. Quite a lot of it, directly above him. He pulled as much energy out of Kairos as he could, solidifying it all around his head. Having a single target to focus all his defenses on was extremely useful. The telegraphed attacks helped, and when the fist contacted his head, he heard a snapping sound. Was it his head, or the fist? Ah, right, the stone bones totem. He could replicate the energy, but not that. At least his nose hadn't been shoved back into his head, and his skull remained three-dimensional for the most part. Kairos gathered more energy on his fist, and as it began to come down towards him, John changed tactics. He didn't have time to surrender or anything, and he, really, didn't want to. If he died after a month or two of this new life, so what? He was barely invested in it so far. He tried, but so far, he just wanted to be strong, and that meant trying to win, not survive. His leg came up between the legs of the man on top of him. He wasn't sure if it was an honorable move, but he doubted that pummeling a man on his back was honorable or any fighting. The area he hit distinctly didn't have any bones, and the disruption slowed Kairos for a moment due to the pain. His fist merely scraped by John's face, scraping skin with the speed it possessed and leaving a trail of blood. He could have probably crippled Kairos, but he was burdened with a bit of sympathy for him. He pushed himself away as Kairos' weight lifted slightly, rolling to his feet. He couldn't reach his sword, but the axe was there. He pulled on the handle facing away from himself, but found it stuck. He grunted with frustration and channeled more of the earth elemental spiritual energy he had stolen, forcing the ground to push it out. Kairos was just getting to his feet when John gathered all of his remaining energy in a wide swing, chopping directly into the man's ribs. To his credit, stone bones prevented him from being chopped in half. John was counting on it. With the direct hit, he still had a huge gash on his side, and the axe cut halfway through several ribs. John pulled back, barely able to see, wondering if the match would be called against him. He was out of energy, after all, and he needed more of his own to steal anything from Kairos. A moment later there was an announcement. He could hear it happening, but he wasn't sure what it was. His ears were ringing, blood was streaming from his nose. He saw stars, and he could barely stand. A few moments later, he felt a hand on his arm. His father, maybe? Then he was taken away. Somehow he remained semi-conscious until he arrived at the medic, who put him out with a faint push of water elemental spiritual energy, a nice refreshing splash of cool, and then nothingness. 2 weeks later, John looked at himself in the mirror. It was obvious his nose had been broken, but it had healed up very well. Cultivator medicines and all that. He'd also stopped bleeding from his nose, which was good because it was hard to be dignified with blood streaming all over you. His family hadn't said anything about the duel, except that he had one, somehow. Kairos was alive and would probably recover on his own. John was glad about that, because he hadn't really deserved anything. Fortkran was the one who deserved it, but he was dead. He just hoped the additional problems from his past were few and far between. The biggest effect from the match was actually inside John. Down inside his dantian where the seed of darkness lived, he found it to be quite a bit more than a seed. It wasn't a massive tree or anything, but there were clearly discernible leaves and roots, still much before a real sapling, but something special indeed. The roots sucked up any spiritual energy that entered his dantian before a refined version was squeezed out like sap. It was still darkness, but there were traces of earth in it. That just further solidified his choice for his next totem. He still had to get there, though. Fighting so seriously against an 8th level spiritual collection phase cultivator had propelled his own cultivation forward, but he still had some way to go before reaching 8th level himself. That would take time and dedicated cultivation, but he felt confident in the process. Where he was less confident was the other things he was responsible for now. The Tenebach family had some spirit stone mines, though they weren't particularly dense. The spirit stones were quite valuable as gems, or usable as a source of spiritual energy for cultivation. There was a certain amount they could speed up cultivation by drawing upon their energy, and so both cultivators and non-cultivators liked them for different reasons. After the duel, John was placed in charge of one of them. It wasn't as if he had to work as a miner. In fact, the job could have been entirely ornamental. There was already a manager there, and the mine was doing fine. However, he felt it was his job to make sure it produced as much as it could. He'd done a small tour of the mine, but hadn't really seen anything that could be improved. He was planning to visit again, now that he had healed up more. Maybe he'd noticed something that his fatigued self hadn't, or maybe he'd just profit off of not doing anything at all, but he felt like his parents didn't want that. Edgar was a large man who managed several of the mines in the Tenebach family. He had once been a miner himself before he worked his way up to being properly the foreman. For the moment, Fortkran, and that was who he had to be at the moment, working for his family, was trying to assure him, "Don't worry. The production has been going fine. We just thought that a different perspective might give us some enlightenment about the mines. This one is new, after all." Edgar nodded. He was a gruff man, but he wouldn't dare be impolite to the young master of the Tenebach family, and Fortkran didn't intend to give him a reason to. "Very well. Feel free to tour the outside. If you want to go in, don't go past the first branch without me." Fortkran nodded. The spirit stone mine was probably stable, but nothing was perfect. Free spiritual energy could mess with even seemingly stable minds. The workers were all cultivators, and they could survive a minor collapse, but it was still dangerous even for those who knew what they were doing. That said, the conditions at the Tenebach mines were apparently better than elsewhere. Some places just wanted to dig things out as quickly as possible without concern for the workers. The pay was high enough some people would still do it. Fortkran looked over the coming out of the mine. While in some places the spirit stones were peeking out, there was a small refinery nearby that would chip away at the rock, occasionally melting it off as necessary. Spirit stones were tougher than normal rock, so there was little chance of damaging it in either case. Still, it was more efficient to refine somewhat locally and not carry extra tons of rock far away. There was still nothing Fortkran had noticed could be improved after a day, but that would be far too quick. Maybe there wouldn't be anything at all, except some financial documents he had to look over. Did he need to try to improve the supply chain? Umberto had managed that stuff for Brad's Burgers, picking the suppliers even when John ran the first store. He could take his time. For the moment he planned to cultivate, he found himself gravitating towards the cast-off pieces of ore and the remnant spiritual energy there. The mines themselves had more, but cultivating inside destabilized things more. As for the tailings, they were much less active than the spirit stones and not in danger of collapsing a cave. It wasn't that much more than the ambient energy, but perhaps there was something to make of it. It was too heavy to transport, but he might be able to do more than just personally cultivate with it. Chapter 16. Cultivation usually made John's thoughts drift to his past life. He wasn't sure why, but when his mind was focused just on the spiritual energy around him, his less conscious parts drifted into memory. John's mind focused on the spiritual energy around him. In spirit stone mines, it condensed into rock and thus would be heavily earth attributed. As an allied element, it was quite simple for him to convert it into darkness, but he wanted to keep it in its natural form as long as possible. It would inevitably be transformed by the seed of darkness, but before that he could have the experience of refining and controlling earth elemental spiritual energy himself. He would need that experience when he reached the foundation phase and got his second spiritual totem. If everything went according to plan, just like darkness, earth had its positives and negatives. It was solid and durable, but likewise stiff and difficult to change. Loose dirt lost the properties of rock, its solidity, but it gained moldability. That was the sort of earth that plants would grow out of, given proper care. That included water, air, and sunlight in most cases. He thought the seed of darkness would be much the same. At least it seemed to like varied elements for it to absorb, though he wasn't sure if light of any form would be beneficial to it. Eventually, he completed a number of circulations of his cultivation. He continued until he was pleasantly fatigued, the point after which his cultivation would require more effort for less return. John stood up from the tailings. It hadn't been a dignified place to cultivate, but it was useful. It was being wasted anyway, if unused. He still had no idea if they could make use of them for others. Perhaps the workers might cultivate in the tailings to become stronger, though it wouldn't support many people. John toured the mines once again, going deeper with Edgar. He still didn't know what he was looking for, but it had to be something. His new family wouldn't be wasting his time, would they? If he was strictly supposed to be ornamental, they would have hopefully said so. Fortkran of the past might have taken the opportunity to do little, but they knew he was different. Yet they also had to know the mines were operating well under Edgar's management. Was there something specific they expected him to figure out? Almost everything was being used to its fullest potential. The tunnels were efficiently laid out and sufficiently safe. Workers didn't have long periods of standing around waiting for others, always having something to do. They also got breaks to recover themselves, which John knew was an important part of work. It might seem more efficient for workers to go all day, but each hour gained wasn't a real hour of work. In fact, each hour of work would be less productive, resulting in a net loss past a certain point. This wasn't even a conscious decision by workers, though frustration could add on top of physical fatigue and make them conspire to only appear to be working. Unlike at Brad's Burgers, the mine didn't have a limited amount of work to do each day. A fast food restaurant would serve all the customers it had to and deal with any inventory that needed handling, but working longer hours didn't bring new customers. Sometimes more labor was needed in a single period, but that required more workers and not longer hours. A mine just had continuous work until it was fully mined out. But that also meant that consistency was more important than speed. Mistakes and injuries meant time and resources dealing with that. Even if they were the careless sort of mine that didn't care about their workers at all, they had to hire someone new. The Tenebach family's mine was perhaps worse working conditions than many places on Earth, but better conditions than most of Marble County. With the workers being cultivators, they could handle the difficulty well enough. John couldn't see that an extra 5 minutes of break or anything else similar would make any sizable difference. Was there something more? Were they missing patches of spirit stones? John did his best to sense the area around the mine. Dense spiritual energy permeated the area, both the cause and effect of the spiritual stones. There were indeed some traces of spirit stones left in the walls, but he could only sense them deep in, small amounts not worth the cost to extract. They might eventually grow, but in that case leaving seed stones behind was better. Something kept tickling at the back of his mind, but he couldn't figure it out. He returned home. His new home was much bigger, and while it grew more like home every day, it wasn't yet really his home. Moving from one house to another without any warning was quite a shift. John sought out the library. "Good evening, Xianxia." "Good evening, young Master Fortkran." Xianxia bowed his head. "What brings you here today? A new combat technique, perhaps?" John shook his head. "Not this time. Though now that you bring it up, I should learn more. First, though, I have to learn more about spiritual stones. Where might I find books on the subject?" "Follow me, young master, and I will show you." Xianxia led him through the library, straight to shelves with related material. He pulled down a few books. "I think these might be the best, though depending on what exactly you're looking for." "Thank you." John looked over them. One was simply titled Spirit Stones. Another was titled Earthen Treasures, and a third was Condensed Spiritual Energy. "I'll look through these and return them later." Reading was faster now that John was a cultivator. His brain had to work faster to react to attacks, so it made sense it could parse words more quickly. His eyes wouldn't hold him back, and his thoughts were faster, though it was hard to say how much exactly. He hadn't measured calculation speed before he started cultivating, but he knew answers came to him faster. Cultivation manuals were usually quite dense, so they took just as long to read through as books he was used to, but merely speaking about spirit stones in general terms wasn't so hard to read. Spirit stones were exactly as they said. Stones made from condensed spiritual energy, specifically that of the earth element. That was the most abundant energy in the stone conglomerate. So of course spirit stone mines were the most frequent and most potent. Earthen Treasures didn't have anything useful to say on the subject, though its information was something John thought he would go back to for other reasons. Condensed spiritual energy, however, connected to that thought John couldn't shake and also couldn't express. Spirit stones were condensed earth elemental spiritual energy. However, they weren't the only thing of the sort. There was also spirit air, fire, water, and extremely rarely, light and darkness. None of the others condensed into nice little rocks, but of course they didn't. Earth was rocks. Water was next easiest to identify and transport. Air required special techniques to bottle, and fire required extremely durable containers. Any of the condensed forms of spiritual energy could also be produced by cultivators, if they gathered enough and chose to condense it into a more physical form. It wasn't an efficient use of their efforts, because they could have directly used it for cultivating, but a few people used the method to make money. Then again, condensed spiritual elements could work almost directly like money, except for the fact that judging their exact value was more difficult. It wasn't like every spirit stone was exactly the same size and quality. Produced ones could be consistent, but even then as the cultivator grew more skilled and powerful they might change. There was actually the technique to produce condensed spirit elements in the book, not something John was interested in learning immediately, but at some point might want to use it. However, the most important part was it sparked his mind. The air in the mines had been quite heavy. The entire energy was suffused with spiritual energy. He could have easily overlooked the details of the air. Perhaps in some places, condensed air was being gathered. Apparently, it would be small bubbles, perhaps 2 finger widths across, remaining in coherent form for the most part. Yet it could easily be batted to the side and fall apart into more spread out energy. Had there also been a few pools of water? He wasn't sure about that, but John felt the hands of his grandfather. He knew that John planned a cycle of elements. Since he wanted to cycle through a conquering path, air would be third on the list. Perhaps his grandfather had visited the mine and sensed it, then thought it would be a good opportunity. Now, if he could just determine if there was actually any of it, and if they could reasonably gather it, he might actually get some results. Chapter 17. Elsewhere in the world, special powders made to detect the presence of condensed spiritual air were commonly available. In the Earth conglomerate, air elemental spiritual energy was rarer, and thus rarely formed into dense clumps, and nobody had need for it. Thus, there were few ways to detect it. John could use his own spiritual energy to try to detect it, but if he disturbed it, he might cause it to disperse. Darkness was one of the opposition elements to air, after all, so their reactions were prone to be violent. That could be related to why cultivation inside the mine might cause collapses as well. So instead of a special powder purposefully made, John was carrying a sack of flour. He would blow it into a tunnel or chamber, watching how it swirled around or if it just settled to the ground directly. He wasn't sure if it would work, but it wasn't as if a sack of flour was costly. Edgar might think he was crazy, but he said nothing as he escorted John through the tunnels. After several hours, John was about ready to give up. Maybe it was crazy to think there would be condensed spiritual air in a spirit stone mine. It was probably more crazy to try to use flour to discover where it was. Storing it in glass bottles was also a bit silly, but he really had no other ideas. He blew the last handful of flour into a room, ready to turn and leave in a huff. Somehow it felt more appropriate than honest disappointment. Maybe that was Fortkran seeping into him, or maybe he just took his new status too seriously. Then the fine powder swirled strangely in one patch of air. John's eyes could see quite well in the darkness, and the flour mostly avoided a section. John stepped closer, pulling out a bottle. If that was what he was looking for, how would he get it in? He would just have to try something. He formed a thin net, sweeping it through the air. He hoped it would repel the condensed spiritual air without dispersing it. Up close, he could barely sense anything, but something ended up in his bottle. John corked it, looking inside with his eyes. There was some flour, but a few gentle shakes showed there was something more than just normal air inside. If he squinted, he thought he could see the light bending slightly around a sort of bubble. Over the next few days, John managed to capture several more bubbles of condensed air. As long as he got them in a bottle, they weren't in significant danger of dispersing as long as he handled the bottle gently. Even when the condensed air lost its form, it just tried to escape the bottle and would eventually reform, except when it expanded too forcefully and cracked the bottle. Deeper in the mines, at the bottom of particular mine shafts, there were also pools of water. Most of it was just that regular old stagnant mine water. However, some of it was condensed by the powerful spiritual energy in the area. To John's benefit, it reacted much more nicely with his darkness element, happily letting him scoop up the little beads which wobbled like jello. He started to gather them into bottles, and eventually ended up with at least 10 times as many bottles of water beads compared to the condensed air. It wasn't enough to make a business out of, but spirit water was at least something sought after in the area. With his current plans, he wouldn't be attempting to attune to a water elemental totem until he was more powerful than his grandfather. Water would be the fourth step in the cycle of elements, and he would get his fourth totem at the consolidated soul phase. That was extremely far off. Even if everything went relatively smoothly, it wouldn't hurt to study some, however. Handling spiritual air was quite difficult. Even contained inside a bottle, it pulled away from John's darkness, sometimes unraveling or reacting with his energy so that both were destroyed. The effect was even stronger when he tried to use a bit of earth, though he did manage to seal a bubble of spiritual air within a rocky shell. It wasn't useful for anything, but he had done it. It was likely to explode at any time, though. Controlling the earth itself was hard enough. It was an allied element, but his nature wanted to convert it to darkness instead of using it as it was. The blessing of the family's guardian beast was responsible for his darkness affinity, though the Tenebach family bloodline was also attuned to it naturally. It was just less powerful at first, receiving a boost that helped begin cultivation. If he was going to cultivate Earth next, he needed something like that. At least, if he didn't want to struggle through the first half of Foundation phase. Earth and Treasures had some things to say on that subject, and John had been browsing for what might be most available in the area. The Earth conglomerate had such things in abundance, but the quality and expense of them varied drastically. The Tenebach family wasn't without money, but there was a limit to how much they could spend on his cultivation. They had other things to manage. After all, it might be best to find one himself. It seemed likely that staying around the clan all the time would stagnate him eventually. He could probably reach the peak of the spiritual collection phase again. But going beyond that could require some experience, luck, or treasures. The more he had, the better his chances. Before he went off adventuring, however, he needed to finish his job with the mine. Deep, deep in the mines the air was foul, and the light of even a lantern hadn't been seen in years. Edgar would have needed one, but John made him stay further away. He could filter the air going into his lungs, and he didn't need a torch at all. He could see quite well in the dark, and he wanted it to be exactly that way. The old and used area of the mine were indeed more dangerous to traverse, but John was now an 8th-level spiritual collection phase cultivator. At the very least, he was far beyond the capabilities of a normal person. As long as he kept his own spiritual energy internal and didn't stir up the abundant energy throughout the mine, he could avoid any hazard that would come to him. It was only his supposition that there might be condensed spiritual darkness in the depths of the mine. He hadn't seen any indication during their tours, but that was why he was in old sections. Torches created light, and even though the light of a torch was very weak indeed, light was the opposite of darkness. It was prone to extreme reactions in the presence of the other, and the book, Condensed Spiritual Energy, indicated that it would need time to build up. Months or years, probably. Any well-trafficked areas would not have any. But with even spiritual air being present, darkness wasn't unlikely. John could indeed sense that the spiritual energy in the area was highly concentrated with both earth and darkness. Darkness was certainly a lesser component, but it would do well with the surrounding earth. John continued deeper, watching his footing on now uneven ground that had been pitted by flows of water or just never properly smoothed to begin with. Mine tunnels gave way to a natural cave, and 2 steps inside a clump of darkness came swooping down towards John. He was used to far corners being dark, so he hadn't immediately noticed the clump up towards the ceiling, despite its contrast with the surroundings. When it flew towards him, shrieking, he reacted with a punch. The spiritual energy around the bat dispersed enough for him to discern that was indeed what it was. But it wasn't a small creature. Its wingspan was as wide as he was tall, and the energy it carried protected itself from his counter, though he knocked it back. He hadn't expected to need his sword in the mines, but he carried it at his side regardless. As the bat swooped towards him once more, he concentrated his energy onto the blade. Though the bat had some power, it was likely just a 5th-level spiritual beast, equivalent to a cultivator of the same level of the spiritual collection phase. Perhaps a bit more powerful, but as a beast it was less able to make good use of that power. As his sword struck the bat, he felt significant resistance for a moment before his sword sliced it in two. If he'd been at the 5th level as well, he would have lost that competition, but then he wouldn't have chosen to fight directly. The beast's corpse might be worth something, though the spiritual energy it controlled had already started dispersing. It didn't seem as if it would retain anything like some would. Looking around the cave, there were no other beasts, but there was another patch of darkness. It was much smaller, perhaps 2 hands across. John couldn't see through it at all, despite his affinity for the darkness. Perhaps that was just what he was looking for. He moved closer cautiously, not wanting to miss any other hidden creatures or other sorts of danger. Chapter 18. The sphere of darkness almost flickered like a torch, the area it was making impossible to see bending and waving. John approached cautiously, not wanting to disturb it too much. He didn't have any containers specially made for it, but he was fairly certain from his readings it just needed to be kept out of the light. He gently reached out with his hand and curled his fingers around it. It felt like nothing at all, yet it moved with his claw grip, and he was able to stow it in a small box he was carrying. John wrapped some of his own darkness energy around the box to keep out any stray light. He wondered if there might be more condensed darkness in the depths of the mines. He kept searching, watching for any hidden bats or other creatures. He saw several, but he moved slowly past and they didn't bother him. He didn't really want to fight anyway. In the end, he found 2 more patches of condensed darkness. He gingerly stowed those away and returned to meet a relieved Edgar. It was John's own decision to go off into the darkness, but that didn't mean Edgar was comfortable with the young master going off alone. It was strange being important, and even more so when he felt like he didn't deserve any of it. In the end, there wasn't much to be done for the efficiency of the mine. However, Fortkran Tenebach presented his findings to his family. The family would sell the spiritual air and water, but allowed him to keep the condensed spiritual darkness to aid his own cultivation. Perhaps that was what they had wanted to begin with, as well as being able to show that he could do something. There were a lot of things from the old Fortkran that needed to be recovered from. It was possible to cut off all light from outside his own personal training room. John now understood why that might be important. After closing himself off, he carefully took out one of the boxes with condensed spiritual darkness energy in it. He carefully pulled out the seemingly insubstantial substance, holding it between his hands close to his body. He concentrated on it, pulling its energy into himself one strand at a time. It was much more pure darkness than any of the free spiritual energy, and he found it much easier to absorb. The seed of darkness inside of him greedily drank up its power, releasing only a small portion for his own use. However, John felt it growing more powerful. The condensed spiritual energy seemed endless, but it gradually faded. Even so, his cultivation had advanced significantly in the past few hours. He could do that at least once more, and perhaps even break into the 9th level of the spiritual collection phase. As the spiritual energy poured into him through his meridians, he felt the effects it was having on him inside and out. His body grew stronger bit by bit, nearly inconsequential, but useful when added to his ability to control spiritual energy. His core of power in his dantian expanded and grew, the seed of darkness leaves and roots growing more pronounced. As he absorbed the last traces of energy from the second condensed spiritual darkness, he felt a ripple through himself as the seed finally became a full sapling. John was certain it was now fully a second-tier spiritual totem. Still not worth much for someone from a cultivation family, but he was hoping his path might become something more in the future. Soon enough, he found himself speaking to his parents and grandfather. "I request an opportunity to go out into the world to temper myself. The previous time that I attempted to break through to foundation phase 1 was unprepared. Now I have a more difficult path ahead of me, and I want to be ready. In addition to that, I believe I will need a proper earth elemental treasure to propel my advancement." His father Confronting Tenebach inclined his head. "We appreciate you taking the initiative in this matter. While it might be better if you were able to reach foundation phase here, if your path of cultivation would be best served by this, we will support you." He turned to Luctus, Fortkran's grandfather. "Indeed. Of course, we will not send you out empty-handed. Some fortuitous encounters are found in the wilds, while some in cities. We shall send one of your uncles with you as a guardian, as well as provide you with sufficient funds to attempt to purchase something of benefit to you. An auction is coming up in Marble City. Perhaps you shall find something there. If not, the city will be able to direct you to opportunities." Fortkran inclined his head. "Thank you, grandfather. I will be certain to act in a way that will bring honor to our family." Sometimes it was good to mention that he was a different person, in more ways than one. He might not have been as interested in honor as this current society, but nobody wanted to screw up in the family. Marble City was the capital of Marble County, as its name might make clear. There were probably many other towns named similarly, but everyone in the area knew what was meant when Marble City was mentioned. John had memories of visiting before, but he hadn't properly taken in the sights. While he'd seen bigger buildings on Earth, he wasn't sure if they were more impressive. There were grand buildings and even palaces where members of the most powerful cultivation families throughout the stone conglomerate might stay, or at least visit. The Tenebach clan was one of the larger forces in the county, but in the entire country they were only considered somewhere around the upper middle. There was a small estate in the city, but since they didn't live far, it was pointless to have more when they could just return to their own lands. A small estate, of course, was still more luxurious than most of what John had experienced on Earth. The former Fortkran had grown used to the luxury, but John was determined not to take it for granted. He still had a few days until the auction, which he would spend cultivating peacefully. He didn't bring any retainers, though the estate had its own servants. His guard was his uncle Aiden, a man past the middle of the foundation phase. He was 2 levels behind Gerben and Celia, and was unlikely to reach soul expansion phase without significant expenditure of resources. It was still possible, because he was still young enough, but he was a steady cultivator unlikely to experience any sudden change. If he hadn't been part of the Tenebach family and received the guardian beast's blessing, he might have done similarly well as an earth element cultivator. John knew that technically he had two purposes for showing up at the auction. Coming without his parents meant that he was being given some free reign of his own, though people would likely assume his uncle was still there to restrict his movements. Perhaps he was, but John was also supposed to buy something at the auction, or at least bid on enough things, demonstrating that the Tenebach family had money to spend and more importantly would let him spend it. Was a reminder that he existed and was still the heir, despite his failure to advance to foundation phase. He really hoped he would find something useful. All of the likely popular items for the auction had been announced ahead of time to drive up interest. Most of them weren't that useful to him. It was unlikely he would find an affordable weapon or armor that was better than what the clan could provide. There were a few earth elemental treasures suitable for foundation phase experts, but winning a bid with one of them would be difficult. A treasure could provide him with abundant energy and perhaps some insights into the earth element that would help with a breakthrough to foundation phase and securing the spiritual totem he wanted. But he didn't need one so powerful. However, though they were generally more common in the area, they were also in high demand. Perhaps there would be some less powerful ones that weren't listed that he could bid on. The announcer for the auctions was an attractive woman. John understood why, because those tactics had been quite effective on the former Fortkran. Maybe he wasn't completely immune now, but he was at least responsible enough to bid properly on things he actually wanted or needed. The first earth treasure came up, and John threw in a token bid near the beginning. It was the core of a giant rock creature that had been destroyed by a soul expansion phase cultivator, and soon its price skyrocketed to 5 times the starting bid, and similarly approximately that much of John's budget. Following that were a number of trinkets that weren't particularly useful or were instead overpriced. As a special event, the woman on stage paused dramatically. This year we have a special opportunity for the lucky visitors today. We have 6 slots to the Great Crystal Caverns, which will open once again this year. We would have loved to advertise this, but the keepers of the caverns, known as the Order of the Amber Heart, are adamant that only those who are fated should be given the opportunity to receive the slots. John grinned and sighed. His grandfather had probably heard about this, and likely many others. Still, that explained the amounts he'd been provided. Presumably, it would be best to buy 2 slots, which meant going toe-to-toe with some of the other families. The Crystal Caverns were a great series of ancient earth mines which constantly produced spiritual stones and earth element treasures. Well, constantly in the way they only opened up every decade or two, but it was one of the great features of Marble County, maybe even the whole of the stone conglomerate. John prepared himself for bidding, wondering what his strategy should be. Chapter 19. It was fortunate that Fortkran had liked to win bids, but didn't like to spend more than he had to. Thus, there were some pretty good memories to work from. Now, all John had to do was consciously execute a plan based on them. This was one of his first public appearances in his new life, and while he wouldn't directly interact with everyone, he knew they would be watching him. Somehow, that made the whole thing almost as nerve-wracking as a fight to the death. Yet treating it like a battle allowed him to apply a certain vigor to it. He scanned the crowd, taking in his opponents. This was a free-for-all, but he didn't have to worry about being swamped by lesser opponents. Only the strongest mattered. At least Fortkran's memory wasn't so faulty as to miss out on members of rival clans. Gaston Boyce was more than a year younger than Fortkran and from a rival clan in the area. They would certainly be interested in securing slots to the opening of the Great Crystal Caverns as earth cultivators. It wouldn't be so hard to secure just one, but John needed 2. It would be a huge risk going without a guardian, since in the depths of the caverns, if he got in a conflict, he could disappear and nobody would be able to point fingers at anyone in particular. John started with an aggressive opening, driving up the bid quickly on the first slot. He locked eyes with Gaston, taunting him to keep up. Soon others dropped out of the race, leaving only John, Gaston, and one other bidder, Casimir Roldan, from another powerful clan in the area. The price was pushed higher and higher. John kept being aggressive, but nobody backed down. He called out a final price with pain on his face, and Casimir outbid him. Nobody else seemed willing to pay more, and the first slot went to the Roldan clan. John sank back into his seat, but firmly stood up again as the second auction began. It wasn't just numbers he called out, it was attacks on the other 2 clans. They needed the slots as well, and couldn't let themselves be outbid so easily. The speed of his bids was the clashing of weapons. He had to restrain himself from actually putting too much spiritual energy into his voice. The second bid climbed higher, reaching the same point. Once again, Casimir outbid John, and John looked towards Gaston, taunting him. His gambit paid off, and Gaston placed one higher bid, securing the first place for the boys' clan. With 6 slots, the 3 competitors could easily share among themselves, but anyone would want to bring along 3 or more members. It wasn't long before the 3rd slot went to Gaston. For the 4th slot, he seemed content to stay more cautious with bidding, but Casimir was matching John point for point. John carefully watched his opponent, pushing towards the highest price he had bid. Then he took a gamble, increasing his bid by nearly a third. His face remained confident, and Casimir looked as if he wouldn't bid, until the auctioneer caught his glance. A single bat of her eyelashes and Casimir outbid him once more, and John sat down. Now, he had to hope he was right. Gaston's timidity in the 4th round indicated he didn't have much left to spend, so it was important that John made Casimir overspend. Was it enough? John let each of them bid once before jumping to just slightly over half the final price of the 4th bid, the most expensive yet. This was the point that mattered most, because while he'd thrown out huge bids in previous rounds, he didn't have to pay any of them. He could have, but he would have spent most of his budget for the most expensive one. His assumption was that Gaston and Casimir had similar budgets, and when neither of them outbid him, he found himself justified. The 5th slot was his, and the 6th? Each of the other 2 bid once, then outbid him once more when he jumped to the same price. But when he made another confident increase, they backed out. John smiled internally, then externally when he had 2 slots secured and a quarter of the budget left. He wondered if he might buy something else. Though he didn't know of anything he was interested in, John finally bid on a darkness-attributed treasure. It was a small pot, though its uses were unknown. The Tenebach clan had many of those that passed through their hands, but they also used most of them. Having one more would be good, and he might be able to use it to improve his cultivation. He couldn't break through to foundation phase without ruining his plans, but that didn't mean he couldn't grow stronger. If he found it wasn't useful to him, another clan member would love to have it. Neither Casimir or Gaston bid on it, since they had little use for darkness-attributed thing, and it seemed their guardians were sternly looking at them from behind. Elemental treasures contained spiritual energy much in the same way as spirit stones and the like, but they could have other uses. Absorbing their energy for cultivation was one thing that could be done, and while it could contain quite a significant amount, the treasure would be destroyed. That was useful when necessary for a breakthrough, but trying to find other uses was better. The pot certainly had enough darkness radiating from it, but upon opening it, John found nothing special inside. The auction hadn't said there would be anything inside, but he'd hoped there would be profound symbols or something he could learn from. Many techniques were developed from treasures found in the world, either natural or created in ancient times. Besides the energy, it just seemed to be a pot for holding things. What specific sort of thing, John wasn't sure, but it seemed powerful enough to contain quite a variety of volatile objects. Perhaps it would be best to keep it for some time to see if he could store something in it. Maybe a treasure from the crystal caverns. It might do to conceal its energy, making him less likely to be targeted. Though he had secured a 2nd slot, and thus would be able to bring his current guardian and Uncle Aiden along with him, that didn't mean there would be no conflict. Indeed, as long as nobody was killed, most tactics were considered fair game. A foundation phase cultivator could guarantee at least he could escape, and so both sides would have the courtesy of leaving the others alive. Fighting a foundation phase cultivator to the death, if they could prevent him from escaping, would leave them open to others who might want to take whatever they found. John's thoughts went to the crystal caverns. The Order of the Amber Heart were the keepers of the caverns and spoke of fated entrance and the like. But he figured the reason they auctioned off slots to enter the caverns was because of the dangers. If only their own disciples entered, they would bear all of the risks. Auctioning off places was guaranteed income, and the fact that they gave others the opportunity meant that nobody rose up against them for monopolizing such a powerful place. The Order of the Amber Heart could take on 2 or 3 large clans with the power they had gained over their centuries-long reign, but they certainly couldn't handle the entire county going up in arms. The Crystal Caverns were basically an extremely large spirit stone mine, though with more dangers and less actual mining going on. Taking the time to tear apart the stone walls was wasteful when natural treasures might have been created every decade. It was said they hadn't been fully explored either, though the tunnels near the entrance were quite well mapped out. They changed slightly with each decade, but mostly in width and crystal formations within. The crystals themselves were constantly growing, but incredibly difficult to extract quickly for the amount of earth energy they contained. Finding those that had already broken off from time was quite a benefit, but most important were the treasures. Even the creatures that inhabited the caves had valuable bodies, various creatures ranging from diamond-shelled turtles to giant moles with claws sharp enough to burrow through rock to creatures of stone and crystal itself, which was the same material as the caverns but free from constraints, as long as they could be slain. Apparently, the time when the caverns opened up was actually the safest time, where the spiritual energy was least volatile and the inhabitants were more docile. Without that, it was possible the Order of the Amber Heart might have been interested in just mapping the whole place themselves in a consistent fashion, taking everything that was within. John was excited about the possibilities, but quite aware of the dangers as well. But he'd already died once, so he might as well move forward with confidence. He'd rather not end his new life with a whimper of giving up. Chapter 20. There wasn't much time between the auction and when the crystal caverns would be opening, just enough to stop by the Tenebach clan and do some research. John already remembered the basics since it was famous enough, but he hadn't expected to actually go, either the him of now or the previous inhabitant of his body. His uncle Aiden knew more, but reading the records was better than just going off of information sticking around in people's heads. Aiden nodded as he read over the information. These reactive zones it speaks of, much like the minds we control, they are areas where disturbances in energy might set off chain reactions. In short, those beyond a certain level are in danger if they enter, unless they do not summon large amounts of spiritual energy. However, Foundation phase cultivators like myself would prefer not to weaken ourselves to be similar to spiritual collection phase cultivators. Whether you enter a reactive zone yourself is up to you. I won't be able to protect you, but there won't be many stronger than you who can make use of their power. Aiden held out his hands in a shrug. There are often treasures that are the cause or effect of such reactive zones, but sometimes they are just dangerous areas. We would do best to start with safer areas before we attempt anything else. John nodded. Of course. I will have to see one myself before I can judge whether it would be safe to go in. It does make me feel better about going myself instead of giving my position to someone like father or mother. Quite right, Aiden inclined his head. And while there might be some inefficiencies involved with including a member of the younger generation, many clans will be bringing their young potentials. You already saw the Boyce and Roldan clans will be participating. Is there anything else of which I should be aware? Just that darkness will likely be less useful than you anticipate. The caverns are not deep and dark in all sections. Crystals reflect and disperse light, and some of them emit it as well. That said, clever uses of darkness can still keep you concealed if necessary, and there will still be darkness in the wider caverns you can use to assist you. John nodded. He wasn't sure if he could feasibly use Earth at the moment without a spiritual totem associated with it, but he did have enough practice that he might be able to throw someone off with it, since they likely wouldn't expect it. The biggest problem, though, would be dealing with others who had higher-tier spiritual totems than himself. Casimir and Gaston should have at least third-tier spiritual totems, and the Order of the Amber Heart had to have at least one disciple with a fourth tier. Instead of competing directly, it would be better to avoid conflict. Just approaching the crystal caverns, he could feel them. Even before John and Aiden reached the entrance, they walked over them. Beneath their feet were at least hundreds of meters of dense stone, but strong earth elemental spiritual energy still leaked out of the caverns. That was even more true towards the entrance, leading them straight to it. Of course, so did their guides and the road. They were of course being escorted by members of the Order of the Amber Heart. There were so many Foundation phase cultivators among them. But then again, that was to be expected. Fortkran would have been at the Foundation phase already if he hadn't pushed himself too hard. And even John could have returned to that stage if he just wanted to push his cultivation forward. But he wanted to be strong, so he was taking a slightly slower path. Hopefully it would pay off. Otherwise, well, most people didn't get a second chance at life to begin with. At least he was trying not to squander it. As they all gathered at the entrance to the caverns, John saw a surprisingly large number of Order of the Amber Heart disciples at the early Foundation phase. Wouldn't it be better for them to have stronger cultivators, and then those with the best potential before foundation phase? Then he smiled to himself. Just because he had to pay for a slot didn't mean the order had to limit itself to a small number of candidates. Considering they could send literally all their disciples and elders in, they were already being conservative. There were a few hundred cultivators totals, mostly from around the stone conglomerate, but some from further away who had managed to obtain a spot. If the crystal caverns weren't so massive, John would have been concerned that there were too many people. As it was, though, he was more concerned that the quality of those around were too high. He had to be able to get somewhere first to get anything, or defeat them and take their treasures, but that was the risky for political and personal safety reasons. Johannes Dallin, the head of the Order of the Amber Heart, came out personally to open the entrance. Before he began, he turned to the gathered cultivators and gave a sort of speech. John could see the influence of many decades of cultivating earth energy, his skin having the tone and texture of granite, and his steps being heavy, though his movements were agile. Welcome. The crystal caverns possess an immense bounty, but also immense danger. Even you fated entrants may not come out unscathed. However, it is quite unnecessary for deaths to happen. Be cautious and courteous to your fellow cultivators. I am sure there will be conflicts, but do remember that this is for the benefit of all. Strangely enough, he sounded like he meant it. That also included the next part. Now then, prepare for what fate has in store for you. John had thought that Johannes would be working with the gathered elders to remove the overwhelmingly powerful barrier he felt over the entrance, but instead he reached forward with his bare hands and entirely without aid tore it asunder. Was that power beyond the soul expansion phase? If he had reached consolidated soul, the Order of the Amber Heart would be gaining even more power in the region. Go now, enter. The man gestured, and people began to move. John caught Aiden's eye, and the two moved simultaneously, Aiden keeping pace with his slower ward. Crystals of all sizes, shapes, and colors filled the caverns, glittering in the sunlight. The floors were covered with loose pieces of crystal that had gotten dislodged from the walls and ceiling. There were stalactites and stalagmites as well, covered in layers of crystal with various thicknesses. Each chunk might contain as much energy as a spirit stone from the Tenebach mines, though not nearly as condensed. If John just wanted to cultivate with earth elemental spiritual energy, he could have sat down in the entrance of the caverns without a care in the world. However, settling for that when he could have more was pointless. He could cultivate and carry out an entire armful of crystals, and it would still not be worth the price of a single one of the slots to enter. They needed more. Swiftness was key. As the young master of the Tenebach clan, John was responsible for picking the direction they went. He had asked Aiden to inform him if he sensed anything in particular that he wished to see, but everything good would be deeper in the caverns. Even their map from the previous time only showed about half of the tunnels in the same place, so it was doubtful that anybody had an advantage. The way the energy slowly stirred into motion indicated not even those of the Order of the Amber Heart had been in the caverns recently. He couldn't have followed them even if he wanted to. With powerful earth all around them, cultivators with that affinity moved swiftly, the ground pushing them along with each step. John had to go for a more conservative approach, using as much energy as he could replenish as he moved along. He wasn't the only cultivator that wasn't primarily cultivating earth, and tunnels went up and down and split so many times he had to be able to get somewhere first. Thus, he avoided tunnels where he sensed others. Without light from the surface like the entrance, only the occasional glowing crystal lit the tunnels they were in, but neither John nor Aiden needed that to see. That said, their eyes were adjusted to the dark, so when they came upon a brightly lit cavern, they nearly blinded themselves. Even with his eyes closed, John found it too bright, and what's more, he could see the source. It radiated energy, powerful light that seemed as bright as the sun. Aiden quickly stepped forward, grabbing a fist-sized crystal in his hand and placing it within a box. The sense of powerful energy was cut off, leaving only the remnants. John could see that there were many smaller crystals emitting lights in the area, though their intensity combined was nothing compared to the single crystal. Neither he nor Aiden could use the crystal they found, but they could trade it or sell it later. Still, they weren't deep in the caverns yet. There had to be yet more exciting things to find, along with the expected dangers. Chapter 21. Shards of crystal flew like spears towards John, but their trajectories were simple and straight. He simply dodged out of the way and allowed them to impact the wall behind him. The sound of their collision was thunderous and grating to the ears. A section of the cavern itself seemed to be alive, a collection of the crystals taking a vaguely coherent form and attacking both him and his Uncle Aiden. Regular attacks with his sword couldn't break through the crystals forming the creature, but if he gathered energy for a gravity blade, it carried enough momentum to shatter some. The creature was gradually getting smaller. He knew Aiden was watching for his own safety, but that didn't mean the situation was without danger. He had to watch out for himself as he made his attacks. Fortunately, the creature was big and slow, and after propelling any of the shards at a distance, it no longer had much control over them. Dodging wasn't so difficult, though he couldn't afford to slip up. The irregular footing of the ground was the biggest problem, and John used a bit of earth energy to get it to conform to him as he moved around. He navigated towards the empty section that was now mostly smooth stone where the creature had first stood up. He ducked under a wide swing from something akin to an arm and parried a crystal shard the size of a spearhead. As soon as the thing followed him into the area, John used hidden steps to confuse it, slipping around to the opposite side of where it appeared he was going. He had already been gathering darkness around his sword and swung it down with great force. As his sword broke through its exterior, the creature shattered into a million pieces, but the force of them wasn't much individually, and those that flew towards him deflected off of his energy defenses. In the middle of a ring of shattered crystal was what appeared at first to be a simple spherical pebble, but on closer observation carried with it great earth elemental spiritual energy. An earthen treasure. John carefully picked it up and sealed it in another container so that it wouldn't disrupt further activities. Good job, Aiden complimented him. Though perhaps the power of your blows could use a bit of work. John shrugged. It was hard to fight on uneven ground, and darkness wasn't well suited for direct attacks against solid targets. Once he had an earth elemental totem, however, he could make good use of earth for such straightforward tasks. Perhaps he could use the treasure he'd just gotten for that purpose. But they weren't done with the crystal caverns yet. They hadn't even gotten to any of the real opportunities yet, though both of them could sense a particular destination they were heading towards. They moved along through the caverns towards a powerful source of energy. It could be danger, but danger also meant opportunities for growth and potential treasures. As they got closer, Aiden shook his head. We're not the only ones to have sensed this. Others are moving in. He held out his hand to stop his nephew. Wait, that crystal, he waved his hand, a flicker of energy touching it briefly, and the crystal then exploded, and even from 50 meters back John felt the shockwave of energy. Extremely unstable. Watch for more of those. Along with the increased frequency of unstable crystals, there were more living crystals that attacked the pair. John could handle one alone, but they came in twos and threes, or sometimes even more. The numbers increased as they moved towards their destination, where eventually the narrower tunnels opened up into a grand cavern a kilometer across. There were only occasional lights from glowing crystals, but it would be enough for a regular cultivator to see by. The two of them, having the blessings of the family's guardian beast, merely made everything clearer. Hundreds of crystal beasts of various shapes and sizes moved throughout the cavern. A particularly large conglomeration of pinkish crystals slowly undulated towards the center of the cavern. Something powerful was there, though whether it was that mass or something it was protecting was unclear. They weren't the only ones to have arrived. There were several other Foundation phase cultivators around. John recognized the guardians of Casimir Roldan and Gaston Boyth. There were also several members of the Order of the Amber Heart present. None had yet made a move into the room. Nobody wanted to be the first to attract the danger, though all were eagerly hoping someone else would so they could reach whatever the treasure might be. There was just one thing missing. There were no other spiritual collection phase cultivators around, even though who should have been with their guardians. One of the Amber Heart cultivators saw them. He smiled. I might look over there, if you feel you have the fortune necessary. John's eyes followed his gesture towards a smaller tunnel leading away. The energy in there was clearly different. A reactive zone. I'm sure your disciples are already in there. Indeed, some are. If you have the fate, you may obtain something there. If not, then the better will take it. The man smiled. That would be Renato, one of our top disciples. but you might still learn something." John looked to Aiden, who shrugged. At least he didn't seem to sense any malice in the man from the Order of the Amber Heart. Just confidence in himself and that disciple. "I don't suppose I'll be of much use here anyway. I might as well try." Aiden nodded. "Do be careful, Fortkran. Such places can be dangerous. Of course, the most dangerous thing might not be the place itself, but the other people there. There were certain protocols to follow, but that was only necessarily true if there were witnesses around. Unfortunately, this world seemed the sort where significant progress required facing dangers." John carefully made his way into the reactive area. At the very outskirts, he tested how it responded to his energy. As expected, his current energy wasn't enough to set it off, but it made things feel shaky. He would still have to watch what he did in the area, especially in a fight. The chances of there not being combat was low, unless he didn't find anything of value. The air grew thick and acrid. The earth elemental spiritual energy was extremely dense, but not in a usable way. It was like walking through mud. He was tempted to use his energy to push against it, but he knew that would do the opposite of what he wanted. He could see why foundation stage cultivators wouldn't want to try. The whole tunnel might just decide to crush them. It almost felt like that regardless. John followed the path until the tunnel diverged. He couldn't particularly feel a stronger energy in either direction. He considered just picking randomly, but he was already behind. He might as well try to find the right way. He opened up his senses, feeling out for something. Eventually, the left path felt like something more, though much of the energy shared the same signature down both paths. Perhaps they looped around on each other. Not running into any immediate dangers only made John more nervous. He felt like he was merely unable to discern the danger rather than there being none. He kept careful track of which tunnels he went down so he could find his way back out. A particular clump of crystals had a sort of look he could solidify in his mind. Cultivator brains were good for something at least. The tunnel diverged again, but instead of left and right, it was forward and down. Or perhaps it would be easier to say there was a large pit in this particular tunnel. It was roughly circular, similar in size to the tunnel, about 3 meters across. It would have normally been easy to jump across, but the uneven footing and dense energy made John hesitate. He carefully looked down the pit and found it continued at least 100 meters nearly straight down before curving out of sight. What was worse were the crystals lining the walls appeared razor sharp. The energy down below was even more dense, and while that might mean great treasure, it also had another signature with it: the scent of death. A careful probe with his energy saw the darkness devoured before it even reached a third of the way down. John shook his head. He wasn't going to go into a death zone, but he might pick his way around. The crystals on the side should hold up well enough for him to skirt around it. He still felt something up ahead that would likely be worth his time. Chapter 22. Sharp crystals dug into John's palms, threatening to cut into his skin despite the layered energy protecting his hands. He was glad he only had to shuffle a few steps to the side to get past the pit. He really didn't want to fall into a death area. He still had many plans for his new life. Then he was across and breathed a sigh of relief. That reminded him of how heavy the air was. It was like it was filled with grit. Earth elemental spiritual energy found its way into his lungs, but fortunately the seed of darkness was happy to absorb that and purify his lungs. It just took a little work. As he approached closer, he was even more certain that the particular concentration of energy he felt was an earthen treasure. John began to notice the walls and floor thinning in crystal density before he eventually stepped into a cavern that was completely bare, except for one small clump of crystals, about the size of 2 fists put together. At the same time as he saw it, John felt another cultivator with an aura of earth stepping in from a different tunnel. The young man clearly also saw the treasure. The young man, who radiated the aura of the Amber Heart's cultivation method, smiled. "It appears that one of us is fated for this treasure. I believe it to be me." He pointed a stone club he had towards John. "Fortkran Tenebach, are you not? Do you wish to concede it to me, or duel for it?" Something about such a polite offer of a formal duel in the middle of dangerous caves made John smile in return. From the expression of this disciple, he thought he would be disappointed if John just gave up. "It may be your fate, or it may be mine." John readied his sword in front of him. "I am indeed Fortkran Tenebach. Your name?" "Renato, of the Order of the Amber Heart." The earthen energy around the man condensed into something akin to a layer of stone. Then we shall fight. One shall walk away the owner of the treasure, and I hope the other will walk away enlightened from the combat. If it was someone not from the order, John would have not considered the possibility of a fair duel. He was still slightly cautious about Renato, but if he conserved enough of his strength to flee, he saw no reason why this other young man would attempt to kill him. Staying behind to secure the treasure would be more important. It was just a question of whether he was attempting to catch him off guard and defeat him in a single blow, though it would certainly be odd to suggest the duel in that case. Renato moved first, his feet crashing into the stone floor of the cavern, their weight obvious. The man himself was not bulky, but he clearly carried the weight of a boulder with him. No, a mountain. John felt the power of a fourth-tier spiritual totem from his opponent. They were both at the peak of spiritual collection phase, but that difference might spell his defeat. The stone club swung with great momentum and unexpected speed. John dodged backwards out of Renato's reach, but the energy around the weapon clipped against his own defenses, shearing off a portion of his darkness. Renato didn't hold back, stepping forward and swinging back and down towards John. He stepped to the side, and his experience training with Brague told him to use hidden steps to move around to the side of Renato. The stone club rebounded off the ground with even more speed, but John swung his sword straight into Renato's side. Stone cracked, but he didn't break through the defenses. The two continued to exchange attacks, John staying light on his feet and Renato directly attacking and withstanding. It wasn't a weak fighting style either. He had the defenses to back it up, and his stance allowed his attacks to be swift enough that Fortkran was hard-pressed. He found himself constantly pulling in energy from around them, but even if he could refine the earth elemental spiritual energy, Renato could do better as a true earth element cultivator. With matching cultivation levels and nearly matching skill, the advantage of the environment and a higher-tier spiritual totem were quite obvious. However, John wasn't willing to just give up on the earthen treasure. It was powerful enough that it might be just the right sort of thing to give him the boost he needed to have a powerful breakthrough to foundation phase. He was confident in reaching that level without such support, but it wouldn't be the same. A plan started to develop in John's head. He continued to press the attack, striking at Renato to prevent him from being able to freely attack. John felt his reserves of darkness elemental spiritual energy drying up faster than he could replenish them, though he still had earth energy to pull on. John prepared his plan. It was a bit of a risk, but if it failed, he would probably just end up with a set of broken ribs. His sword cut down at an angle, slicing towards Renato. The attack was so obvious that even Renato was comfortable stepping a half step to the side to avoid it. John just hoped he didn't notice how much earth energy was included. Hopefully those senses would be dimmed by the abundance around them. Or Renato might just not believe that John could control it. His sword struck the ground, and the oft-used rebound technique propelled it back towards Renato at a slightly different angle. The attack struck Renato in the side, and John pushed with all the earth energy he could gather to push away Renato's own energy. Of course, that was only slightly possible, but he at least weakened the strength of the stony barrier around him. Renato was sent flying into the wall, but that didn't make John confident. Swords were for cutting. Being sent flying meant the momentum was dispersed. He pointed his sword towards Renato, watching carefully. A moment later, Renato stood up and then leaned on his long stone club. HMMN. I had not expected such control of earth from a darkness element cultivator. I deeply desired this one, but perhaps you might truly make better use of this treasure. Renato waved. Go ahead and take it. I'd prefer to conserve my remaining strength for future treasures. John kept his eyes on Renato just in case his words weren't sincere, but he was able to pick up the treasure and store it in a concealing box with no issues. Renato was already walking back out the tunnel he came from, but just as John finished sealing the treasure away, Renato came out of the tunnel again, backing away with his weapon at the ready. What's this then? A voice John found annoying, though perhaps more because of its owner than any particular quality of the sound, came from the hallway as Casimir Roldan stepped out from the tunnel. One of the leading disciples of the Amberheart and Tenebach, tired out from a skirmish, no less. Next to Casimir was another cultivator, close to the peak of spiritual collection phase as well. We're going to need you to hand over that treasure you just found, as well as any others. Then we can let you scurry around to find replacements without any further issues. A reasonable duel didn't make for instant friendship, and John was closer to the tunnel he'd entered from. No chance. He darted off down the tunnel, making use of what earth energy he could gather to smooth his movements as he came back into an area with irregular footing from extreme crystal growth. He'd hoped that Renato might slow the two cultivators down, but Renato wasn't far behind. He couldn't blame him, though. The two of them seemed faster than Casimir and his ally, though they couldn't keep running forever. They hadn't fought to complete exhaustion, but they certainly weren't at their peaks. Ah damn, John spotted the pit again. It wouldn't be a problem to get past it before the others caught up, but why, what a coincidence. Gaston Boyce was standing on the other side, along with one more peak 9th level cultivator. I sensed something special down this tunnel, and it came right to me. John seriously doubted there were any coincidences involved anywhere. He must have been sensed, and they could have figured out where he was going. He looked to Renato, who shrugged. Casimir and the other were only a short distance behind, and they were getting closer. TCH, bad luck for you, Tenebach. Now, hand over that treasure. John pulled out the box and opened it up. This one. Then he tossed it over his shoulder into the pit. Whoops, I dropped it. The first to react was Renato. Instead of moving to break past the other cultivators or anything John might have expected, he dived down the pit after the treasure. His head turned to follow that motion, and that slowed his reaction to Casimir's charge enough that he could only block. He had stopped several meters away from the pit for that very reason, but it hadn't been far enough. He found himself going over the edge, and he slammed into one of the walls on the way down. He felt the crystal shards slicing through his flesh and felt the true cruelty of the world of cultivation. The sense of safety he'd felt from the agreements not to kill others in the crystal caverns was, of course, not entirely binding. If he got a third life, John vowed not to be so flippant. Chapter 23. It was physically impossible for every crystal shard on the edge of the pit to cut John as he fell, but it certainly felt like that was what happened. The fall lasted several lifetimes, and he was only barely able to summon enough of his remaining energy to prevent his body from falling apart on the way down, though it was devoured by the area even as he fell. It was almost difficult to believe when he found himself at the bottom, even vaguely conscious still, unless he'd blacked out for a few minutes. Next to him, he sensed Renato. He turned his head to see Disciple of the Order of the Amber Heart in only slightly better condition than himself. Why are you down here? Renato crossed an arm over his chest and held up the clump of crystals sticking out in all directions. You threw this away, so I would say you have no claim on it anymore. You wanted it that much? John shook his head. As he moved to sit up, the ground stabbed into him. Not so much as the blade-like crystals on the way down, but in the dull pain of stepping on an unbreakable thing on the ground, like Lego. He scrounged around in his pack, though it was half on the floor already. He pulled bandages out of the pile and started applying them with some herbs. Why give up on it then? You could have won that fight. Perhaps. Though I imagine we would have ended up here regardless. Renato shrugged. I felt that fate was guiding my hand. But now we'll both just die. John shook his head. It will just be slower. John winced. Well, slower for you maybe. Or quicker. The energy down here. It's quite something. Condensed. Hungry. Renato took a deep breath, a serene smile on his face. Dangerous. Perfect for a breakthrough. Unless you explode. Don't forget that can happen. John shifted and heard something crack beneath him. It wasn't him. But the crystals couldn't possibly be that weak. When he looked down, he realized he wasn't lying on a bed of crystals at all. Irregular hard objects? Absolutely. But aside from a few poking through, he was mostly on a layer of bones. Oh, that's not good. What's not good? Renato asked. Did something happen? The bones? Oh, you can't see in the dark. John held up half of a shin bone. Or maybe not. The bone radiated energy from the environment, or did it belong to the former cultivator? These are bones. Ah, I see. Renato reached around and picked one up, feeling it in his hands. That does seem to be the case. He pulled his hand away and rubbed his fingers together. Dusty. John dug his hand into the pile. bone dust, and many little shards, like people, exploded. Down here, he walked over to the edge of the pit. He barely had the energy to stand, let alone lift himself up by sharp crystals. He didn't need to bleed anymore. I don't sense them at the top, though who knows if I even could. John shook his head. You dropped your urn. Renato held up the darkness element treasure. I thought you'd want to know. Don't want to leave it down here. You say that like, we can get out of here. Can you even stand up? Almost certainly. Pretty sure you have someone's leg through your leg? Correct. Do you have any more bandages you could lend me? Did you not bring any? Renato held up a bundle of cloth that was completely torn to shreds. Of course. I see you found the walls too. John handed him the rest of his roll of bandages. Here. Thank you. Renato pulled the shard of bone out of his leg and wrapped the bandage around it. He attempted to use energy to help seal the wound, but the energy around them reacted, focusing on the energy and pushing into the wound. Fortunately, it was only for a moment. I suppose I shall settle for wrapping it. Might as well. John picked up the pot. You said this was an urn? Is it not? John opened it. Might be. He frowned as he turned it around. The thin layer of bone dust that was on everything, including getting into his lungs now that they'd stirred it up, simply wasn't on the urn. With nothing better to do than hope something useful would happen, John dug for a handful of bone shards and dust and tossed them in the urn. Nothing happened. He put the lid on and shook it. Maybe it just didn't stick well. Upon opening the lid, he found no dust or bone shards inside, and the energy had seeped from the bones into the urn. Fascinating. I'd love to have a chance to study this, then just live. There's no way we can climb out of here. Two exhausted soul collection phase cultivators like us. We mean it, you know. The fate thing. Renato held the earthen treasure they'd fought over firmly between his two hands. We could be fated to die here, or some of the extras, but maybe we were supposed to end up exactly here. If so, won't we end up something special? I don't know you that well, but without bragging I can say I'm not just an average disciple. It would be a shame to just give up. John thought for a few moments. Was he anything special? His talent was fine, but there was indeed something that made him special. He couldn't say how many people transmigrated into new bodies only to die within a few months, but he was hoping that something about that made him special. Well, I do need to get back to my family. Exactly. And with two of us, the chance of one of us making it out is twice as high. If it's me, I promise to carry as much of your body as I can with me to return to your family. I'd appreciate being brought back to the sect if I explode myself. Renato shifted slightly further away. We don't have that much room down here, but we either die, not breaking through, or try to make something of ourselves. Might I try my breakthrough first? I'd rather we not interfere with each other. Go ahead, John said. If he didn't have to try to break through in a danger zone, he would be quite a bit happier. He didn't have the energy for it regardless. He moved away and started adding more bones into the pot. How much could it hold? If it started seeming unstable, he would stop, but he found himself quite curious. He messed with the urn while watching Renato. He was actually gathering energy, disturbing the area around them. He was right that they had to try, but it was crazy to do so. The energy was thick and dense like stone crushed by the weight of a mountain above. The crystal treasure in Renato's hands was dense in a different sort of way. As Renato began cultivating, he drew the power into his body, and into his bones particularly. Immediately the energy reacted, pushing down on him like a crushing wave. Renato's body trembled, but he didn't stop. He was like a whirlpool at the center of the energy, drawing in power faster and faster. It was already beyond the point a spiritual collection phase cultivator could handle, probably beyond what a foundation phase cultivator could or should deal with, and it wasn't slowing. John felt Renato's bones trembling, a keening sound coming from them. He was going to explode, and that wasn't going to be good for John either. Thinking was for those who had options. Sometimes when there was a rush of customers, you just started working, not thinking about whether you could handle all the orders, but just doing it. Likewise, John had no options now. Renato was moments from exploding and wiping him out along with him. He threw himself next to Renato and placed his hand on his head, atop his skull where he had the most contact close to bone. He was able to siphon energy off of others and convert it to his own, and that was what he began to do. The sapling inside of him greedily consumed the incoming energy, but John felt his meridians trembling under the power coursing through them. Fortunately, he was merely drawing in from a secondary source, so the whirlpool of condensed energy in the area didn't focus on him. However, his body still was having trouble standing up to just being next to it. Then John felt a tugging. The urn was still in his other hand, and it began to pull energy out of him into it. The urn charged with earth elemental energy, and soon it was filling to the brim. John pulled the energy back into himself. He'd already attempted to break through to foundation phase once in his memories. The problem then hadn't been a lack of energy, but certainly more would have been better. Now he had far too much. But energy flowed from the condensed crystals and the surroundings into Renato, from Renato into him, into the urn and back into him. At all times they were just a moment away from an explosion, until finally it happened in a great cataclysm of energy. Chapter 24. Waves of energy reflected back and forth between the two cultivators and the walls around them, seeming to grow stronger. In a desperate attempt to absorb some of the energy, John let himself be pushed along by it, moving in such a way that would soften the damage as much as possible. He found that his instincts seemed to have done him some good, but he didn't move as he expected. His body remained where it was, but his soul flew off into the sea of spiritual totems. He hadn't planned to immediately pick a spiritual totem, but the process would help him absorb more energy. If he didn't, he would likely die. If he was too slow, the same. However, he had already taken the time to peruse his options. There was one he particularly liked. The cave had been his choice, an earth elemental totem that also had ties to darkness. As he was moving towards his chosen totem, he felt something tugging at him. The darkness treasure. It led him towards a pile of dirt. It smelled foul, like rotting things, but of course, that was what it was. A moment later, his impression of it changed. It smelled like fresh soil. Had it transformed into a different totem? Not at all. That was merely what it was. Dirt. This particular visage of it was the aspects of it that involved the decay of life into particularly nutrient-rich soil. That is to say, compost. The world around John trembled, threatening to break. He knew his body was in a precarious state as well. Earth element with ties to darkness? Check. Second tier? Check. Able to grow? Probably. With the prompting of the treasure with him, he really couldn't second-guess things. Maybe this was fate, or maybe it was just good enough for him to not die. His hand stretched out, forming a connection between himself and the spiritual totem. There was endless abundant energy to make use of, and he needed to do so to not be torn apart. He fused with the totem, and it formed a representation of itself inside his dantian. He found himself back in his body, a whirlpool of energy. Foundation phase was a bigger change inside of himself than he'd thought it would be. He didn't have time to take a full stock of things, but the single step he'd taken was more than just the doubling in power he'd thought it would be. Next to him, Renato had also broken through. Energy continued to reverberate from them to the walls and back. But as the two of them manipulated it, it slowly fell into a pattern of destructive interference. In short, it slowed and stopped gradually. John coughed up a mouthful of black liquid. Blood? There was certainly some of that in it. His bones were creaking and his skin torn apart, and his internal organs were a mess. But he felt great. That was probably just the high of adrenaline. Renato was sitting as still as a statue. Actually, it was more than that. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. John still felt some life from him, but it was faint. Then there were cracking sounds. It was awful to listen to, but when he finally saw a layer of stone fall off Renato like peeling skin, John was relieved. The other man blinked as he was finally able to move his body. Well, it does seem that we haven't died. I appreciate your assistance. I wasn't able to handle the energy as well as I thought. John shrugged. Me neither. He looked up above them. The tube that had been lined with myriad sharp crystals was now worn smooth, which explained the few pieces sticking into his head and the layer of dust all around them. He was glad that he'd unconsciously filtered the breath going into his lungs, though he supposed he might not have as much trouble breathing earth as he might have thought. Renato narrowed his eyes. Earth? Were you? unable to properly connect to a darkness totem? This is intentional, more or less, anyway. He didn't want to explain the whole thing to someone he'd known for an hour or two, or however long it had taken them, even if they had gone through life and death together. So, Renato, how about we try to climb out of here? Renato looked up. Smooth walls. That's more troublesome. We are in danger if we summon enough energy to pierce the walls, but together it should not be a problem. It is not such a wide pit after all. He stood up and held out his hand. Shall we continue to work together for our survival, Fortkran Tenebach? John took his hand and pulled himself up, trying not to show the full extent of pain his body was in. Gladly, he looked around. I seem to have misplaced my treasure. Renato sighed. Me as well. Perhaps they were destroyed. I certainly wouldn't be able to find those specific shards of crystal among the rest here. Now then, despite the heaviness of this place, we can just walk out. Walk? John raised an eyebrow. Renato turned, finding the narrowest part of the tunnel heading up, then placed a foot against the wall, his back to the middle. Walk. Just stand back to back, and we can move ourselves without relying on external uses of energy. John did as he suggested, pressing his foot against the other wall. Their backs pressed into each other, feeling much more stable than the actual configuration truly was. Then he pulled up his other leg, and he was in the air. Coordinating with Renato's movements wasn't the easiest thing in the world, but they moved slowly. If they had merely been in a normal tunnel of the size they were in, it would have been trivial for them to get out. A relatively fit person could move up a chimney like they were in without too much trouble. Theirs happened to be smooth with occasional razor-sharp crystals, and in a cave full of energy that resisted their movements and taunted them to try to use their own energy, at which points it would reverberate through them and potentially break them apart. They moved one step at a time. The fall probably wouldn't kill them, though they couldn't be sure that they wouldn't hit the ground harder than the first time, falling without the luxury of scraping against the walls, and with higher cultivations, the chamber below might react poorly to their landing. But they were able to keep all their use of energy just to their bodies until they reached the top. I'm going to be honest, John admitted. I'm not looking forward to how we stop being like this. We'll just have to push off. Ready? John sighed. As much as I'll ever be. On the count of 3? And it was as simple as that. The two of them ended up on opposite sides of the pit, but they were out. I do believe I shall be leaving this way, Renato said. I believe there were some minor treasures I passed by. You know your way back out. I do. Be careful. Of course, I will not forget to control my energy to below a certain level until we leave. That was also a reminder for John. He found that moving through the tunnels was like walking through mud. The dense energy pushed on him harder, and he wanted to push harder. Back. Which would have been a mistake. He was barely able to keep on his feet, despite the energy he found swirling inside himself. When was the last time he ate? He wasn't sure about that. His bag had been fully destroyed, so he didn't exactly have anything munch on. He started finding his way towards the exit. Hopefully, his memory wouldn't fail him. Fortunately, the energy didn't decide to crush him for being a foundation phase cultivator, though he kept his energy well under wraps, using it as little as he could. He just hoped he didn't have to fight. As he walked along, John felt slightly more at home, yet more intimidated. He now had an earth elemental spiritual totem, but that just made him more aware of the danger of the crystal caverns. He passed through the room where he'd parted with Aiden. The pinkish crystals were mostly removed, whatever power they had taken away. He didn't see any bodies, but he wasn't sure that they wouldn't have been absorbed by the place itself. The damage to all parts of the walls, floors, and ceilings indicated there had been a significant amount of combat in the area. John would have liked to stay to seek more opportunities, but he was at the end of his stamina, and without a method to recover it. It was said that high-tier cultivators could sustain themselves on the power of the universe, but maybe they just had bags full of food and didn't like to admit to a little snacking. His stomach grumbled as he found his way towards the real exit of the crystal caverns, using his memories and his vague sense of the outside world to guide him. He didn't spot anyone on the way out, nor any creatures. He supposed he'd already traversed the path once, but it was still strangely empty. As he stepped outside the caverns into the setting sun, he saw a mere handful of people. Among them, he recognized Johannes Dallin. Were they so free as to wait outside? Young fellow, Johannes spoke first. You are quite tight on the timing. We were about to seal this place. Seal it? But isn't it open for weeks? How long do you think it has been? He didn't actually know. It was quite easy to lose track of time while cultivating, especially in strange places and exceptional circumstances. He wasn't even really sure how long he'd been down in the crystal caverns before everything happened. It could have been half a day or 2 days. Now then, move aside so we can begin the sealing. Wait, John said, catching himself. Please, Sect Master. Has Renato come out? He was in there with me a few hours ago. Renato? Johannes narrowed his eyes. I have not seen him. Can the sealing wait a few more hours? He was taking a different path out, one with which he was familiar. Johannes burrowed into John with his gaze. You certainly know the right things to say. He is one of our most prized students. However, what I overheard indicates that he might not return. If you are asking us to wait for the sake of someone else, John clapped his hands together and bowed his head. I swear that I was with Renato not long ago. I know no others I care for who went into the tunnels, except my uncle Aiden Tenebach. I assume he is already out? The sect master of the Order of the Amber Heart shook his head. I did not keep track of him in particular, but I can say all of those who will leave are already out. As for you, we will have you wait here. If Renato is really on his way out, we will owe you some sort of favor for delaying us. Otherwise, well, we're not interested in starting conflict. We'll merely forbid you from returning at the next opportunities the caverns open. But the sealing should begin as soon as possible. John moved over out of their way and sat. He knew his words were true. Hopefully, Renato had a better sense of time and would hurry to the exit. He didn't have any more supplies than John himself. To take his mind off of the subject, he started to gingerly cultivate. As the two energies he now possessed flowed through his meridians, they entered his body, repairing his wounds. His mind eventually found its way to his dantian, where he found his two spiritual totems, though they appeared much like one. The seed of darkness had become a sapling, and now it sat in a pile of compost. Plants go in dirt. John grinned tiredly to himself and hoped Renato made it out, for several reasons. He didn't exactly have many friends, and he'd quite like the chance to come back to the Crystal Caverns. Chapter 25. Though they were being polite about it, John knew he was just a step short of being held captive by the Order of the Amber Heart. Then again, he could feel how the Crystal Caverns were reacting now while they were still unsealed. He couldn't help but watch nervously, hoping Renato was able to make it out. He said he was going to stop by and grab some treasure he'd seen. But how long would that take? Was his path out longer? Worries filled John's head. He wasn't sure if they were friends, but as someone he'd at least fought death with, he would much prefer Renato to live. Just as Sect Master Johannes was reaching the peak of his impatience, Renato came running out of the trembling caverns. Sect Master, he bowed. Elders, it seems more time passed than I anticipated. Renato's eyes landed on John. Johannes had a twinkle in his eye but tried to speak sternly. You are fortunate that Fortkran Tenebach told us you had been seen recently. Otherwise, we would not have waited. Now then, step aside so we can finish sealing the caverns. Renato's arrival was a huge sense of relief for John. There were many practical benefits, like goodwill from a large faction and one of their disciples, in addition to having one of the few people he liked in this new world still alive. He felt somewhat wrong for judging someone by the value they could have for each other, but then again, that was what people did on Earth all the time. Usually they were just less open about it. However, his interactions with the Tenebach clan here was all about what mutual benefits they could provide. Speaking of which, it is good to see you made it, Renato. John inclined his head. I must go find my uncle. I can lead you to the guest area, Renato offered. They will at least know if he has gone back to the clan. It wasn't hard to find the right place. Renato took his time walking, clearly fatigued from his flight out of the crystal caverns, but soon enough John sensed Aiden. He had only just managed to reach the door and raise his hand to knock when it opened. Fortkran, you arrived at the very last minute, it seems. Aiden looked over him, clearly recognizing his advancement to Foundation phase, but not without some benefits for your efforts. Good. You can never be sure what will be in danger zones. I would have liked to stay behind to welcome you out, but that would have just wrapped us up in the same trouble. Aiden looked at Renato, who was standing nearby. You don't need to mind me, sir. Renato bowed his head. I won't give up any secrets you share, though I'm sure you'd be more comfortable if I left. He nodded to John. Fortkran, make sure to visit sometime. I could use a good sparring partner outside of the sex styles. He also probably wanted to win, since Renato hadn't quite gone all out in their little duel. But John could sense his friendliness. Of course. Good fortune to you. I could always use more. And to you as well. With Renato's departure, Aiden waved John inside. Foundation phase. And Earth Elemental Spiritual Energy. Quite a surprise. This was always the plan. John shook his head, though I would have preferred less chance of death. Tell me about it, Aiden asked. We have time. I have sent for some of your uncles to escort me back to us. Now, I didn't want to risk. Well, I can tell my story after yours. John explained what had happened, leaving out some of the less important details. Though, he made sure to mention how people had attempted to kill him. The Roldans and Boyces. Huh? It's mostly your word against theirs, though if that fellow from the Order of the Amber Heart backs you up, there might be something to gain. I'm sure they'll be quite surprised to find you alive. As for what happened with me, a dozen Foundation phase cultivators of various levels stood at the perimeter of the room, waiting for others to make the first move. However, their hesitation allowed the crystal caverns to make the first move instead. As they looked towards the moving creatures of pinkish crystal, their presence was noticed. Though in the case of the creatures, it was more that they were finally acknowledged as some sort of threat. The hundreds of creatures moved in unison, and a wave of Earth Elemental spiritual energy poured from them, along with a hail of sharp fragments of crystal. Aiden himself sensed their flow and dodged past them, though some of the Amber Heart cultivators withstood the attack directly. That opened up the floodgates, with the cultivators all breaking into movement. Aiden himself avoided going directly for the center of the room, instead circling around the edge of the cavern watching. Several masses of living crystal moved towards him as he drew his warhammer. Unlike what many people thought of warhammers, they weren't big and heavy. Certain sorts of cultivators could get away with oversized weapons, but the base size was a rather smaller weapon. It had a half long enough to hold in two hands, but the head had a spike merely 10 centimeters long, and the whole head, including the hammer side, was probably around a kilogram. It still had some mass to it, but it relied more on speed to hold its energy rather than merely mass. The first creature to approach was shattered by the hammer side as Aiden gathered his energy. He was fairly certain they had no eyes, and living in an environment that had no natural light meant it would do him little good to try to intensify the darkness in the area. Other cultivators were fighting using their senses or using light sources, but of course Aiden had no need for such. He kept light on his feet, always ready to avoid the needle-like rains of crystal, and as the crystal creatures got close, he also needed to avoid the much more ponderous swings their human-sized forms could produce. He found himself fighting several creatures at once, only occasionally getting a chance to counterattack. However, though they carried the strength of an early Foundation phase cultivator, they didn't have the technique that went with it, and their teamwork was limited. In short, as long as he didn't let himself get hit, he could take them out one at a time. Because he'd remained at the perimeter, there weren't as many after him. But that was a disadvantage as well. There was something in the center that he could sense, and those who had gone closer were more likely to be able to get their hands on it. Before Aiden could move in, another handful of cultivators started entering the room, fighting their way towards the center of the oblong cavern. Though since there were others ahead of them, they were barely delayed. Meanwhile, for Aiden to reach the center, he would have to pass at least a dozen crystal creatures and potentially fight 2 cultivators from the Order of the Amber Heart. The chance that they would interfere with each other instead of choosing to stop him was minimal. Aiden shattered the last of the creatures near to him and was preparing to leave the area. No sense expending energy on something he couldn't benefit from. However, as he was trying to determine exactly what it might be, and if it was worth risking his life fighting several people at once, he noticed something. There was certainly a concentration of energy in the center of the room, but there were small pulses elsewhere. He had to wait for the feeling to come again before he was sure. There would certainly be something special at the center of the room, but with the cavern being more of an ellipse, it had 2 focal points, not actually at the center. Aiden swept his gaze around the room, and noticed that some of the crystal creatures were forming up to defend locations that weren't just the center. Darkness was more than just one thing. It could be, just as its name said, actual lack of light. But beyond that, it was one of the elements best able to specialize in stealth. Those around couldn't really see Aiden, but they could feel his energy and use their own to sense him. But if he restrained his own energy, they would have to be actively looking exactly where he was. He hoped that the crystal creatures weren't able to actively sense anything. After making sure nobody was actively sensing him at the moment, Aiden slowly lowered his energy signature. That meant retracting most of his defensive energy as well, so he would be vulnerable to an attack if it came. He slowly moved through the dark cavern towards one gathering of crystal creatures, particularly large ones at least half again as tall as a man. If he was right, he would be able to slip past them, and if not, he would have to react quickly enough to not find himself crushed or pierced through. Aiden slowed even his breath as he stepped 1 foot at a time, limiting his vibrations through the ground. 10 meters from the creatures. 5. Then he stepped between 2 of them, hoping they weren't just pretending to be fooled.